Chapter 2065. Illusion Sovereign punched forward. Space distorted, forming a black whirlpool. It was like a black hole that sucked in Nangong Miao's starry sword. The sword couldn't pierce through. Nangong Miao revealed a dissatisfied expression. A powerful sword intent surged from Tianlun, and a powerful aura pressed down, enveloping Illusion Sovereign. In an instant, the two's positions changed. It was as if they were in an endless starry sky. The stars in the sky exploded with radiance, and countless stars formed into lines that evolved into patterns. Illusion's Sovereign resisted the sword intent in front of him. He suddenly raised his head and saw that there were countless sword lights chasing down from the patterns above the vast starry river. Cycle sword technique? The Illusion Sovereign's heart was filled with fighting spirit, and he shouted loudly. The sound waves turned into an imposing aura that swept out, causing the entire space in the galaxy to tremble. The falling sword lights were all suppressed, either stagnating or weakening before gradually disintegrating. Ha! Nangong Miao's sword aura was broken by Illusion Sovereign. In the outside world, he suffered a second impact. His body leaned back, and he uncontrollably retreated. After stabilizing his steps, he looked at Illusion Sovereign with even more dissatisfaction. He was a proud sword cultivator of the South College, the great Tianlun sword god. Yet, he was defeated by an old man with a small Tianlun. It was a loss to the South College's prestige. Get out! Nangong Miao let out a stern voice. His long hair danced wildly with the sword aura. His sword slashed out beautiful divine light. Every ray of divine light would turn into a sharp divine sword. In the blink of an eye, thousands of swords fell. The intertwined sword river surged, trying to blast Illusion Sovereign out of the sword discourse arena. Illusion Sovereign snorted coldly. He had been cooped up in the Dongwang realm for almost 10,000 years, protecting the Phantom Continent for the God of the East. It was not easy for him to let go of his heavy burden and come out. He was lucky enough to encounter a sword cultivator battle from a large world. How could he let Nangong Miao withdraw with just a few words? As a sword cultivator of the Seamless Realm, Nangong Xiong was not suppressed by the heavenly Tao. This was a heavenly advantage. He had a saint-grade Great Tianlun, which was a higher grade than Illusion Sovereign's Great Tianlun. This was a personal advantage. Still, it wasn't as if the Phantom Lord didn't have his own strengths. The spatial divine will of the Grand Tao of the Seamless Realm was quite abundant. Not only did it not affect his ability to fight, it even helped to increase his divine power. So what if the heavenly wheels were weaker? He had 10,000 years of foundation. How could Nangong Zong possibly compare to him? Both sides had their own advantages. He did not feel that he was inferior to Nangong Xiong. So why should he leave? You're the one who should leave. The Illusion Sovereign's good temper was worn down, and he began to feel impatient. He took a deep breath, as if he was sucking in the space Tao will of the sword field. The heavenly wheel divine light erupted with an even more intense light. It was the Illusion Lord's unique divine skill, one breath moving heaven and earth. Wang. The great Tao of space distorted as wisps of white gas were spat out by the Illusion Sovereign, transforming into illusory shadows that filled the sky. Their movements were uniform as they struck out with their palms. Instantly, the space of the East sword field trembled and became even more unstable. Countless sword cultivators looked over in shock as their hearts trembled. They discovered that this ordinary-looking elder actually contained such a majestic spatial divine will of the great Tao. The Illusion Sovereign strike was truly imposing. It truly shocked many people. Even Zine and company who were spectating from the outside did not expect him to have hidden such a move. From the looks of it, the Illusion Sovereign was still holding back during the battle at the Kunlun Sea. Junior brother, you're in danger. The two Heavenly Wheel Protector of the South Court sensed that something was amiss as they hurried over. And at that moment, the Heavenly Wheel Sword River that Nangong Miao had released clashed with the Heavenly Palms. Booming sounds rang out incessantly in an abnormally violent manner. The palm forces and sword chi that had been knocked off course by the collision flew out diagonally and struck the other heavenly wheel protectors. All of them grunted when they were struck. Wah! The sword river's momentum ruptured as the heavenly wheel sword chi was thrown into disarray. Many of the stellar streams reversed as they stabbed towards Nangong Miao. As Nangong Miao withstood the suppression of the illusion sovereign's spatial palm, he also had to deal with his own chaotic heavenly wheel sword chi. He was instantly thrown into disarray as he panicked. "You are still too young after all," the illusion sovereign said coldly. Did he really think that he had eaten for 10,000 years for nothing? Attack! The heavenly wheel protector of the South Court saw that the situation was unfavorable. They knew that if this continued, Nangong Miao might be injured. Therefore, they took action as the two of them blasted out heavenly wheel sword beams at the illusion sovereign. Wong! 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 The surging sword intent stabbed over as it flew forward. Many spatial phantoms collapsed as it quickly arrived beside the illusion sovereign. The illusion sovereign's expression changed as he could not help but feel angry. The South Court was a hegemonic faction of the celestial realm. How could they send three great heavenly wheel protectors of the sword competition to deal with a mere lesser heavenly wheel protector? Boom! Violent shock waves blasted his body. In his haste, the illusion sovereign was only able to block one strike. This was the limit of his ability. After all, the two South Court experts that attacked had deeper foundations than Nangong Miao. Furthermore, they were native sword cultivators of the seamless sword. A mouthful of blood dyed his beard red. The illusion elder's body flew backwards and heavily smashed into the light screen of the Eastern Sword Field. The moment he hit the sword array, his entire body disappeared. When he reappeared, he had already fallen outside of the field, onto the ground of the training field. Illusion Sovereign. Qin Hao hurriedly strode forward and helped the illusion sovereign up. He looked up at Nangong Miao, who was in the sword array, with an extremely cold gaze. "Are you all right?" Patriarch Qi and Patriarch Chu rushed over with Tai Chu and took out pills. Cough, cough. "I was too careless. I couldn't avoid it." The illusion sovereign coughed out 2 mouthfuls of blood and consumed the pills. His complexion turned for the better. The 3 heavenly wheel protectors of the South Court joined forces to force him out. Although it's not against the rules for the sect to send a Tao protector into the arena, the South Court's action is really shameful. Patriarch Tai Chu said. The battle also had to look at the situation. The battle between Tao protectors of the great clans was nothing much, but the South Court sending 3 against 1 was clearly bullying and unfair. However, the Academy wouldn't care. After all, those Tao protectors of the sect also met the standards of the sword competition. They couldn't stop them from entering. As for how they acted after entering, the Academy could also forcefully interfere. Even if it was unfair, it was still unavoidable. However, no matter how they fought, the eyes of the Academy's elders were clear, who relied on their own abilities and who relied on external forces. The Academy was well aware of it. Why don't the 3 of us enter as well and dampen the spirit of the South Court? Patriarch Chu said. Save your strength, old ghost. Those with 2 divine marks can't enter. Shizu said. I forgot. Patriarch Chu was slightly embarrassed. He wanted to help the illusion sovereign vent his anger, but now he couldn't. How can we tolerate this? Wuk said to Qin Hao. The illusion sovereign had left his home and followed Qin Hao all the way here. Wuk brat, don't cause trouble. The illusion sovereign shook his head and looked at Qin Hao, saying, It's not a big deal. I just lost in the battle. It's my fault. In this sword competition, he only wanted to test his Tianluan ability, not to become a disciple of the Academy. He had stayed in the Phantom Continent for too long. In such a small place, the illusion sovereign basically didn't have the chance to fight with others. Today he had fought with so many Tianluan from the Seamless World. He was satisfied and satisfied. Let's go back. Qin Hao looked at Nangong Miao, who was using the power of the sword formation. He disdained to make a move against such a clown. Immediately, The crowd gathered around the illusion sovereign and returned to the Western Capitals team. My disciple's performance is not bad. That person has an extraordinary space, Dao will. It's commendable that he couldn't hold on for so long in my hands. Dinan was very happy. He looked at Daisakong and said, "He's from the Kunlun Sea, right? Although he's not from a Western capital, you sent a guest elder who doesn't even know any sword moves. You're not taking the academy seriously. You're not respecting the academy enough. Take care of yourself. What kind of ability is 3 Tianluan against 1 person? You seem to have one honorably. Is this all the Southern Academy has?" Daisakong replied with a cold face. In the Western Sword Field, 100 Nirvanas from the Southern Academy formed 100-people sword formation to besiege Wuk. In the Eastern Sword Field, 3 great Tianlun experts joined hands to deal with the Illusion Sovereign and Little Tianlun experts. When Nangong Miao fought alone, he was almost blasted out by the Illusion Sovereign. If it wasn't for someone intervening later, the outcome might not have been certain. Just based on Nangong Miao's performance, did he deserve to be called a genius of the Divine Region? Daisakong was really disappointed in the Southern Academy's so-called #1 sword genius. He didn't have the strength and ability of a genius. Unfortunately, the Illusion Sovereign wasn't as good as Wuk. Otherwise, if he blasted all the people from the Southern Academy out of the Eastern Sword Field, how could Dinan laugh? Boom! In the Eastern Sword Field, Big Dipper Yi's aura was chaotic. A scarlet sword light brushed past him, and a wound appeared on his arm. In front of him, 2 guardians of the Big Dipper mountain drooped their heads. One on the left and one on the right. They had no strength in their bodies. Young Master Yi, you've just reached the heavenly Luan realm. It's commendable that you've persisted until now in the Eastern Sword Field. However, you still have the chance to participate in the Sword Conference next time. Nangong Miao shouted across the air. He looked at the beautiful woman in front of Big Dipper Yi. In the time it took to drink a cup of tea, she had actually captured the 2 heavenly Luan guardians of the Big Dipper Mountain. Moreover, she had only injured Big Dipper Skylord's grandson with 1 strike. Her strength wasn't simple. I didn't expect my infinite divine world to have such a powerful sword cultivator. I'm unlucky. However, Brother Nangong, your situation isn't too optimistic either. Don't you have any thoughts about the Eastern Divine Heaven? Big Dipper, he covered his arm and stared cautiously at the beautiful woman in front of him. She had easily defeated his guardians. He knew that he would definitely be eliminated. The Sword Conference had taught him a profound lesson. However, Nangong Miao's situation wasn't much better. The remaining sword cultivators weren't easy to deal with. While he still had strength, he might as well find the most outstanding genius to test his sword. In Big Dipper Yi's eyes, Eastern Divine Heaven's Loi was undoubtedly the strongest. Moreover, Loi's performance had indeed suppressed one side of the sky. If Nangong Miao had any ambition, he should go for Loi. Even if he lost, he would lose in glory. After he finished speaking, Big Dipper rushed towards the beautiful woman. Before he left, he released his last radiance. Eastern Divine Heaven. Nangong Miao looked towards a certain direction in the sword arena. There, a beautiful woman lay on the ground with heavenly Luan sword cultivators. She was as powerful as the Queen of the Heavens. This Loi had an immortal level heavenly Luan. She had rushed up to the 9th level of the sword-seeking pagoda and triggered a total of 80 swords. She was only missing the last sword to completely comprehend the sword spirit Dao, will of the Divine Master, Divine Soldier. Her talent was so strong that it made people tremble. Nangong Miao remembered clearly that when Loi triggered the last sword, the heavenly might of the divine world descended from the heavens. That was definitely the will of the Divine Master. This woman actually attracted the attention of the Divine Master. One could imagine how shocking her strength was. Thinking of this, Nangong Miao suddenly had a thought. It was as if he didn't dare to face Loi of the Eastern Divine Heaven. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to escape from her sword. Chapter 2066. The situation in the East Sword Field was getting clearer and clearer. As the number of sword cultivators continued to decrease, The difference in strength between the remaining ones was getting bigger and bigger. Now that the sword conference had entered its final stage, no one was prepared to hold back anymore. All of them took out their trump cards. The battle was even fiercer than before. Many clans also clashed with each other. Figures were constantly defeated and left the stage. The battle was pushed to the peak. Come at me together. Loi stood in the air of the sword field. The divine light she emitted was dazzling, noble, and powerful. It was as if she was the embodiment of thousands of merits. At a glance, it made cultivators of the same level feel inferior. The frost flower divine intent spread out from her body. Sparkling and translucent ice flowers slowly floated down and engulfed a large area. Many experts from the major clans were trapped in this area. Everyone in this space felt a bone-piercing chill. Too arrogant. Someone pointed angrily at the sky. This disciple of the East immortal heaven released her divine will and surrounded over 100 Tian Luan cultivators. Did she want to defeat them all by herself? How arrogant was she? Impudent. With a thud, someone stepped up from the ground and grabbed at the air. A dazzling sword light formed under his palm. Tian Luan particles rolled and rolled. Sword Tao divine power poured into the sword's soul. He stabbed at Loi with all his might. Loi looked at him coldly. Her slender hand waved casually. An ice flower fell from the sky and suddenly released a divine light. It exploded into a huge divine sword shadow and heavily slashed at the opponent. Boom! Thick white frost spread out from that location. It was as if a majestic fog had erupted and enveloped the person. No sound could be heard. In the next moment, as the white fog dispersed, a human ice sculpture was revealed. The sword cultivator who attacked was frozen alive. It was as if he had lost all signs of life. Countless Tian Luan cultivators trembled. When Loi attacked, the sword soul, sword intent, and even the opponent's divine Tian Luan were all frozen. Even his will was frozen. How monstrous was her strength! Another attack. The sword cultivators who had experienced the Sword Inquiry Pagoda were dumbfounded. Until now, no Tian Luan cultivator in the East Sword Field had been able to withstand one attack from Loi. As expected of a top genius who had rushed to the 9th level, she could be said to be invincible. Isn't there anything decent? Loi looked down at the crowd below. Many disciples of the famous sects in the divine territory were trapped in her divine decree of frost. However, none of these sword cultivators, who were usually arrogant, dared to look her in the eye. Disappointment, dejection, and a trace of anger mixed in. In such a large divine realm, the Eastern Sword Field was actually unable to meet a qualified opponent. Even if she wanted to lose fairly, it would be difficult for her to do so. The fairies of the Eastern deity, Heaven, who accompanied Loi into the sword matrix, smiled silently. From the looks of it, there was indeed no one in the Eastern Sword Arena who could make Loi lose. It was completely unnecessary for the Celestial Lord to send them to accompany her. With Junior Sister's talent and ability, not to mention this Eastern Sword Field, even in the entire infinite divine realm, there are very few heavenly wheels with 2 divine marks that can defeat Junior Sister. Unless it's a 3-mark expert, the grade of the heavenly wheel can't be too low. A fairy laughed. The Seamless Realm was still a small place. What she wanted to say was that within the 3 major sword realms, how many people at the same level as her would be able to guarantee that they would be able to defeat Loi? Even if it was Lu Qiu and Long Mian, could they guarantee it? They probably wouldn't dare. For better or for worse, you are all noble clans of the divine realm, and many of you are also substitutes for the heavenly Tao controllers. Being so cowardly, you really don't act like men at all. Another fairy shouted downwards. Her gaze swept through the crowd and specifically landed on Nangong Miao. Now, Nangong Miao was also under Loi's divine will of frost. On the other hand, Nangong Miao, the youngest and most talented disciple of the Southern Academy, who was often praised by Headmaster Nan, didn't dare to raise his head to look at Junior Sister Loi, just like the others. The Southern Academy's #1 sword didn't really live up to his name. As if sensing the gazes of the fairies of the Eastern deity Heaven, Nangong Miao slowly raised his head and secretly clenched his fists. He faced Loi, who was as noble as a queen, and shouted, "Since that's the case, the Southern Academy would like to experience Fairy Loi's sword Dao." The Southern Academy was one of the giants of the divine realm, an existence on par with the Eastern deity heaven. How could they be underestimated? After saying this, Nangong Miao's body flashed with divine light. "You're not good enough. You're too weak." Loi glanced at Nangong Miao indifferently. She didn't seem to be interested in him at all. "You?" A heavenly will protector of the Southern Academy was slightly angry. "Fairy Luo possesses the divine will of frost. You must be Senior Dongxing's true disciple. Even so, you're too arrogant. My junior brother, Nangong Miao, is also a disciple of the Academy's supremacy. Your statuses are on par." Nangong Miao directly attacked. He leaped up, and the heavenly wheel's radiance bloomed. Astral particles condensed into a sword in his palm, and he charged towards Loi. He knew that Loi was very strong. He didn't want to face her, but he had to face her now. If not, how would the divine realm evaluate the Southern Academy? Was it afraid of the Eastern deity heaven? Was the heavenly cycle sword technique inferior to immortal Dongxing's divine will of frost? In this battle, he carried the reputation of the Southern Academy, so he had to take action. "I said, you're not good enough." Loi didn't dislike Nangong Miao, but she was very disgusted by people who didn't have any interest in pestering her. She pinched a falling ice flower between her fingers and threw it at Nangong Miao. When it left her hand, the ice flower turned into a snow-white sword that seemed to ignore the great Tao of space. With a thought, the sword had already flown over. Buzz! Powerful sword chi pressed down from the heavens. A bright moon divine sword carried with it raging frost, as if it wanted to bury the universe. In an instant, it invaded Nangong Miao's body, penetrating the heavenly wheel and seeping into his flesh, soul, and will. Nangong Miao instantly felt as if time had frozen. His movements became incomparably slow, and with it, the divine power in his body became sluggish. The heavenly wheel's sword intent began to decline. Gradually, he felt as if his divine power was frozen by a chill. His blood stopped flowing, and even his thoughts stopped under the sword light falling from above. Boom! Violent star particles surged. His self-esteem and pride forced Nangong Miao to break free from the suppression of Loi's sword intent, allowing him to unleash all he had in his life. Beams of dazzling star sword chi rose from his body into the sky. He shouted and roared. His entire body seemed to have turned into a star sword shadow, flying together with tens of thousands of sword chi and colliding with the falling frost divine sword. Boom! With a second dull sound, the tens of thousands of star sword chi were dyed white and frozen in midair. At the same time, they shattered into pieces. The huge bright moon divine sword was extremely heavy, pressing down on the sword light that Nangong Miao had transformed into. It fell wildly until it crashed into the ground. Junior brother. The two heavenly wheel protectors of the Southern Academy were shocked. Nangong Miao couldn't even withstand a single sword strike from Eastern deity Tian. The Academy's sword conference tests one's ability. When did the Southern Academy learn to be opportunistic? Loi glanced over indifferently. With a glance, tens of thousands of layers of frost swept over and blasted on the two heavenly wheel protectors of Nangong Miao. In an instant, the bodies of the two great heavenly wheel experts were penetrated by a terrifying chill. Their divine power was frozen, and it was too late for them to release their heavenly wheels. Their bodies were covered with ice, and they were sent flying out of the boundary of the sword formation. They fell awkwardly on the ground. Another strike. Countless sword cultivators sucked in a breath of cold air as they looked at Luo Yi in shock. The three great heavenly wheel experts sent by the Southern Academy to the East Sword Field were suppressed to the ground. It was said that in order to ensure that the disciples could last until the end, the Southern Academy specially chose two great heavenly wheel experts who were about to break through to the second line. These two people couldn't even withstand a single strike from the Eastern Immortal Heaven's disciples. Moreover, even Nangong Miao couldn't withstand it. Wasn't Nangong Miao a well-known leading figure of the younger generation in the divine plane? Why was his strength so weak? Truly, if one did not try, one would not know. Once one tried, one would be startled. It looked like the southern courtyard's evaluation of Nangong Miao was somewhat exaggerated. However, everyone also knew that the Eastern Immortal Heaven's disciple was too strong. She was obviously the same as the others, also at the first line, but the strength of the divine intent she released gave people a terrifying feeling that she couldn't even reach the second line. Who was this Luo Xianzi? Did she have a strong background like the Witch Clan? Cough, cough. Violent coughs came from a sword pit. Nangong Miao, who was in a mess, climbed out. His weak body swayed a few times before he could stand firmly. When he looked up at Loi, his face was filled with sorrow and desolation. As expected, he couldn't withstand a single strike from her. At this moment, the feeling that Loi gave Nangong Miao was no longer just a powerful queen of the heavenly court. Instead, she was as bright as the daughter of a divine king. She was so distant and unattainable. Is this the power of the immortal level Tian Luan? Nangong Miao let out a bitter chuckle. The last trace of pride on his face had vanished under that sword strike. He lowered his head and staggered out of the sword formation, his back looking very down and out. Once he had boasted in the Big Dipper Mountain that there were many talents in the infinite divine domain. This was the era that belonged to him and Big Dipper. Even if he met Lucio of Rikujinji and Long Miao, the true Dragon Prince, he was confident that he could fight them back and forth, because he always thought that Tian Luan was of the same grade as Primordial Spirit. It was only because of some innate condition that cultivation was more important. As long as one's divine path was deep enough, any so-called innate advantage was nothing. But today, he suddenly realized that his bold words were so laughable and ironic. He was like a frog at the bottom of a well who didn't know how vast the world was. Big Dipper's words at the divine advancement ceremony still rang in his ears. If I enter the academy, even if I meet Lucio and Long Miao, I might be able to fight. Could he fight now? He couldn't even pass the academy's sword conference. Facing Loi, who had the same level of Tian Luan as Lucio and Long Miao, he couldn't even withstand a single strike. How ironic. That cocky brat finally came out. Outside the arena, Sihuan looked at Nangong Miao's appearance. He seemed to be quite miserable. It's not that he's weak, but that the opponent he met is beyond his level. He's just a mantis trying to stop a chariot. He's just overestimating himself. Zhang Ji commented, "Do you still need me to prove anything now?" Qin Haiyan lazily. Nangong Miao had underestimated the grade of Tian Luan. According to his understanding, everyone in the untainted world had a chance to become a divine king. But how many divine kings were there in the untainted world? Only a few, including those who were qualified to compete with divine kings. There were definitely less than 5. After all, Qin Hao had seen the ability of divine kings and knew very well how difficult it was to obtain that kind of power. It was impossible for people like Nangong Miao to stand among the top geniuses of the untainted world. Long Miao and Lucio were nothing. They were just dust under the glory of the supreme geniuses of the untainted world. Even Qin Hao didn't dare to say that he could safely retreat if he met such a person. Chapter 2067. After Nangong Miao was eliminated, a figure fell out. It was Beidou Skylord's grandson, Beidou Yi, who had been defeated by the beautiful woman. The famous sex of the divine realm, as well as the direct descendants of the great clans of this world, were constantly eliminated. The fighting on the East Sword field gradually calmed down. Currently, the only place where the fighting was most intense was where the beautiful woman attacked Li Guangxing. Qin Hao watched the battle on the light screen of the sword matrix. The divine sword released by the coquettish woman was very special. The red sword caused ripples in the space, like turbulent sound waves. It contained a formless killing intent that could affect the mind of a swordsman. It was Li Guangxing's first time fighting with the beautiful woman, so he was also affected by her, but the effect was not too great. Unlike the other Tian Luan who had completely fallen, he quickly adjusted. After stabilizing his mind, the pressure of his sword became stronger and stronger, and he gradually gained the upper hand. Brother Li has a deep foundation, and his sword heart is extremely stable. He has a higher chance of winning this battle. Qin Hao had been watching for a long time and could already determine that the beautiful woman's sword intent had a bewitching nature. It was also a kind of spiritual great path. This kind of ability was actually very strong and pervasive. It could directly affect the divine soul, weaken the opponent's divine power, and disintegrate the Tianlun. Li Guangxing had been cultivating for a long time, and his sword heart was as stable as a 10,000-year-old rock. It was the most difficult target for a spiritual cultivator to break through. It was very difficult for her to penetrate the other party's will. Xin and the others nodded. When Li Guangxing activated the sword-seeking pagoda, the Tianlun divine he released was very special. It was not like the ordinary Tianlun divine will. It should be a kind of variant extension, coupled with his deep foundation. Even if the beautiful woman swept a large number of Tianlun experts, she would probably be defeated. At this moment, Loi was also paying attention to this battle. Li Guangxing and the beautiful woman were considered top experts in the e-sword field. After this battle, the remaining person was qualified to compete with her. Boom! Li Guangxing waved his duster of Dao, and his body flashed with dazzling light. Ancient swords were born under his duster of Dao, and he threw them forward. Tens of thousands of ancient swords flew out and formed a mysterious sword formation, forcing the beautiful woman to retreat step by step. Eventually, she was forced into a corner. After the battle, the beautiful woman's aura had weakened a lot. Her breathing had become hurried, and sweat had appeared on her face. She stared at Li Guangxing and felt the overwhelming sword aura pressing down on her. It was hard to understand how a sacred sky wheel could erupt with such tyrannical power that no one could shake. The cinnabar between her eyebrows flashed with a red halo, and a gorgeous sea of flowers bloomed behind her back. The bright red flowers swayed with the waves, tender and beautiful, but when the petals fluttered in the air, the red light was even sharper than the sword light. Bang! The sword formation hit the sea of flowers and turned into a violent turbulence. The ancient swords flew through the sea of flowers, and the vigorous sword intent destroyed the sea of flowers. The bright red flowers withered instantly and turned into bubbles. Faint blood seeped out of the corner of the beautiful woman's mouth. Her body flew out diagonally from the sword field and landed on the ground. She retreated a dozen steps in succession. Then, a bitter expression appeared on her face. She bowed to Li Guangxing and said, "I've learned something." She admitted defeat. Li Guangxing nodded slightly in response. He seemed to have sensed something and turned to look at Loi. Their eyes met, and Li Guangxing said with a smile, "It seems that the e-sword field will be decided between me and little friend Luo." The sword competition in the field had completely subsided. There were very few experts left, and no one could do anything to each other. Now, he and Loi were the only two who had not lost. Like me, you triggered 80 swords. Old Mister's ability is very good, but I, Tianlun, am stronger than you. The one who will lose will not be me. Loi was very confident. I have cultivated for a longer time than you. Little friend, make your move first. Li Guangxing stood with the dust in his hand, showing the demeanor of a great master. Okay. Loi nodded in response. The frost divine radiated out, and a bright moon appeared in the ice. It gradually overlapped with her body and merged into her flesh and blood. In an instant, the radiance on Loi's body was incomparably dazzling. Her temperament was even more outstanding than before. She was so holy and noble that no one dared to look directly at her. She had not released Tianlun before this, because the opponents she met were not worthy. Facing Li Guangxing, she could not underestimate him. Suddenly, the sword cultivators in the sword field all retreated, making enough space for the two of them to display their skills. Several fairies of the Eastern Divine Sky also left Loi's side. This battle was used by Loi to test her talent and prove herself to the Academy. No matter the outcome, no one else could interfere. At this moment, even the spectators from the Endless Realm became serious. They had both activated the 80 swords of the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. Between Luo, Yi, and Li Guangxing, it was unknown who was stronger. "What do you think?" Zine asked Qin Hao. Qin Hao smiled. "It's hard to say." On the surface, Loi seemed to have the advantage. However, Li Guangxing's Tianlun could not be measured by conventional standards. Qin Hao could not determine how strong it would be after it was completely unleashed. It was something to look forward to. "Be careful," Loi said. The bright moon absorbed the frost divine will, and the aura around her surged. "Stop." Suddenly, a majestic voice broke the atmosphere and spread into the sword field. Loi stopped. She and Li Guangxing looked in a certain direction at the same time. They saw the Academy elder who was hosting the sword competition in front of the Divine Hall take 2 steps forward and say, "Just now, the 6 elders conveyed the divine will. The 2 of you have obtained the elder's approval. You can both become disciples of the Academy." "Oh," Loi responded indifferently. She retracted her gaze and looked at Li Guangxing again. Looking at her posture, she did not intend to stop. Li Guangxing's sword will churn around him. The ancient life armament on his back that had never been unsheathed also floated beside him. This was his sword and also his sword soul. Similarly, he did not plan on stopping. "The 2 of you do not need to pursue results. If you want to test your abilities, then spar with the disciples of the Academy." The Academy elder's voice fell. Suddenly, 2 tyrannical sounds came from the void. 2 beams of dazzling sword light pierced through the interior of the Academy and stopped above the training ground. Then, in a flash, the sword light pierced into the sword matrix and turned into 2 figures with powerful auras. They stood in front of Li Guangxing and Loi respectively. They're disciples of the Academy. Everyone outside was surprised. The Academy had sent disciples of the previous batch to spar with the 2 inside. It was obvious that they valued Loi and Li Guangxing very much. "Junior brother, are you ready?" A middle-aged man who stood in front of Li Guangxing said. Now, the elders had given the divine will and allowed Li Guangxing to enter the Academy. Then, they would naturally be fellow disciples in the future. "Senior brother, please enlighten me." Li Guangxing swept his dust and rushed forward. The ancient life weapon beside him was unsheathed with a swish. Sharp light cut through the air and attacked at the same time. In an instant, he clashed with that middle-aged disciple, and an intense sword storm erupted. "Junior sister." The other disciple wanted to speak to Loi. "Who is your junior sister?" Loi interrupted. The other party had a dumbfounded look on his face. "If the 6 elders really want to see my talent, send someone else. He won't be able to do it." Loi's gaze swept past the disciple in front of her and spoke to the elder of the Academy. Many people were speechless. The disciples of the Eastern Celestial Heaven were too arrogant. Even if they had suppressed the East Sword Field and were only undecided against Li Guangxing, they couldn't underestimate the disciples of the previous batch. Those who could enter the Academy were 1 in a million. When this sentence was spat out, the disciple in front of Loi couldn't help but reveal a look of displeasure. He wasn't worthy? Ha! The Academy elder who was hosting the sword competition laughed and waved his hand. "Danqing, you can leave." "Uncle Master." That disciple had a stunned look on his face. "Because it's very likely that you aren't her opponent. Leave." The elder waved his hand. "Yes." The disciple, named Danqing, suddenly felt a pressure in his chest. He took a deep breath and flew out of the sword field, standing behind the elder. "You don't even think highly of a disciple of the Academy. Who do you want to spar with?" The elder shouted at Loi. Could it be that it was their Academy's turn? Or the elders? "I'm not looking down on the disciples of the Academy. I'm just speaking the truth. Senior, please don't blame me." Loi didn't want to waste her time on meaningless things. Next, her gaze pierced through the light screen of the sword field and looked outside. With a single glance, she saw Qin Hao's figure and pointed in the direction of the Western Capitals group. "There's someone there." I want to spar with him. Regardless of the outcome, I will enter the academy. Western capital. A strange look flashed in the eyes of the academy's elder as he looked at Daisakong, who was beside him. Daisakong didn't seem to have reacted and was stunned. This is bad. Qin Hao knew that things were bad. Loi's gaze was like a sword piercing towards him. He said to Xin, "Senior apprentice brother, I suddenly have some urgent matters to attend to. I'll be returning to the Western capital first." Without waiting for Xin's reply, Qin Hao hurriedly left the training hall, taking small steps as though he was running away. If he was allowed to spar with Loi, he would definitely expose the matter of the Eastern Immortal Heaven that night. "Junior apprentice brother, why are you running? Wait for me." Sihuan was baffled. He chased after Qin Hao. Swish! A streak of sword light flew over, transforming into a human figure that descended and blocked Qin Hao's path. Loi spread her arms, her face cold. "Are you afraid? Afraid of losing to me?" Qin Hao didn't know how to reply. He was indeed afraid, but not afraid of losing. "What's going on?" Today, there are so many geniuses of the seamless realm present. Even the Academy disciples don't want to fight. Why do they choose him? Who is this person? What's so special about him? Countless people were puzzled when they saw Loi block Qin Hao. It's him. Nangong Miao's brows were deeply furrowed. He was also puzzled. He naturally remembered Qin Hao, a scoundrel who avoided fighting him. He only knew alchemy and knew nothing about sword arts. But why did the powerful fairy Luo choose a nameless scoundrel to spar with the sword? Could it be that Nangong Miao had made a mistake? Did this alchemist of the Western capital actually have some skills? At this moment, everyone in the training hall was filled with doubts. After all, they had never seen Qin Hao before. He was very unfamiliar. He definitely wasn't a genius of the divine realm. Even the Academy elder's face was twisted. It was somewhat ugly. Wasn't this slapping the Academy disciples' faces? Abandoning the Academy disciples and not fighting. Choosing to spar with Qin Hao alone. What kind of ultimate skills did this person have? Junior year can't avoid it. Daisakong thought to himself, a sinister smile on his face. A guy who didn't want to spar with the sword and only wanted to hide his fame was pushed into the field of vision of everyone by Loi. Once the two sides fought, then junior year's sword Dao would definitely stun everyone. At the thought of this, Sikong Wan secretly glanced at Dean Nan, who was next to him. After Nangong Miao was kicked out of the competition, Dean Nan was listless and looked extremely haggard. If he was allowed to admire the performance of junior high, it would be like adding oil to the fire, and he would be in so much pain that he would rather die. Chapter 2068. The Taoist Arena of the Seamless Academy. Countless swordsmen of the deity realm were staring at Luo, Yi, and Qin Hao. Luo, Yi was extremely powerful. Everyone had seen it for themselves. As for this silver-haired youth from the West Capital, no one knew how powerful he was in the Tao of the Sword. I've said that I didn't come to the Academy to participate in the Sword Conference, nor do I want to compete with anyone. Why do you have to force me? Qin Hao's face was filled with worry. We didn't finish the last time. Let's continue. Loi's reason was very simple. No. Qin Hao went around her and wanted to leave. It's not up to you. Loi opened her hand and grabbed Qin Hao's shoulder. Woman, you're so rude. Sihuan couldn't stand it and stopped her. It's none of your business. Get out of my way. Luo Yi waved her hand, and a cold air that was filled with white frost started to wreak havoc. Sihuan's cultivation was not good, and she howled as her body flew out randomly. Qin Hao used a fleet-foot stride and leaped into the sky. Loi reacted extremely quickly and chased after him. There was no way she would let Qin Hao escape. Suddenly, two figures rose into the sky from the Academy's training hall. They turned into rainbows and chased after each other. The speed of the divine wheel was so fast that it disappeared from everyone's sight in the blink of an eye. Buzz! At this moment, a majestic divine splendor swept out from the depths of the Academy. It was like a sword light that contained endless power. Wherever it passed, everything in the heavens turned into the great Tao of space. This divine splendor was very fast. It enveloped the entire divine realm in the next second. Qin Hao, who was walking in the sky in the distance, was immediately obstructed. The power of the world. Countless swordsmen looked up at the sky. It was majestic and boundless. The will that appeared seemed to be the absolute dominator. It was the will of the great path of the Divine Master. Dong! There was a sudden muffled sound. Qin Hao seemed to have crashed into a thick wall. His body was shaken, and he took a few steps back. He stopped for a moment, and an unbearable pain came from his nose. Tears were about to fall. Divine power. Furthermore, it was not simply divine power. Instead, it was world power. Could it be that this majestic and unparalleled will belong to God, Lord of Ichi? At this moment, dazzling particles of light appeared in the air, and a layer of light began to extend infinitely under their feet. It was as if a high platform had been constructed out of thin air, lifting Qin Hao and Loi up. A huge stone pillar hung down from each of the four corners of the high platform, upon which were engraved imposing figures. Each of the figures moved differently, and they exuded boundless pressure of the divine Tao. As the platform moved slowly, it carried Qin Hao and Loi back to the Academy's territory. It floated above the Taoist temple and was exposed to the public. Let's fight. There's no time limit. We'll fight until the victor is decided. A calm voice that contained unparalleled divine might echoed out from the depths of the Academy. Upon hearing this voice, the tens of thousands of sword cultivators present were filled with awe. Even Daisakong, Empyrean Northern Dipper, and Dean Nan, these lofty heavyweights of the divine realm, were as obedient as children. I only want to watch the battle, but you want to see my performance. Qin Hao looked down at the pitch-black Endless Realm sword cultivators, speechless. The transparent barrier of light beneath his feet was created by God, Lord of Ichi's divine power. The four pillars that supported the four corners were clearly extraordinary objects. They exuded an aura of endless vicissitudes. They were most likely ancient treasures that had been passed down since ancient times. Run? If he didn't fight with Loi, Qin Hao wouldn't be able to escape even if he had wings. He wasn't stupid enough to try and shake the strength of a god lord. Are you satisfied? Qin Hao stared coldly at Loi. This was all because of this barbaric girl. Loi's lips curled up in a faint smile. She didn't say anything else and directly attacked. She slowly raised her palms, and a thick divine light of frost began to emanate from her body. Her aura was countless times stronger than that of the sword discourse arena. Every single ice flower that floated down from the sky seemed to be able to destroy a major plane. Go! Loi's divine will swept forward. Frost danced in the air, and like a blizzard, it flooded towards Qin Hao. Qin Hao glanced at Fairy Clear Rong through the barrier of light beneath his feet. He sighed helplessly in his heart. He used the fleet-foot steps, and his movements were as smooth as the wind and flowing water. He cleverly weaved through the frost light, not daring to face Loi head-on. The monstrous frost light shrouded the area, and the ice flowers whistled like sword light. They flew back and forth, emitting sharp and ear-piercing sword sounds. Looking from below, it seemed as if thousands of sword lights were crazily intertwining, forming a sword net. And Qin Hao was swimming in the frost light. Facing such intertwining violent sword lights, he was actually at ease. The spectators below broke out in a cold sweat. There's actually such a mysterious and unfathomable movement technique in the world. He's treating the divine will of frost created by the immortal venerable Dong Sheng as nothing. Heavens, no one in the E-Sword field can block Fairy Luo's sword, but that guy is strolling in her impenetrable sword light. Senior Sikong, may I ask who this brother is? Is he the exclusive disciple that Senior has secretly hidden? Countless people were shocked and asked the king of the West Capital. Although Loi's divine will of frost couldn't be compared to that of the immortal venerable Dong Sheng. After all, her cultivation was obvious. But Loi herself was already an extremely terrifying existence. Almost no one in the same realm of the divine path could withstand her sword, not even Nangong Miao. It could be imagined how amazing the strength of the silver-haired young man strolling in the divine will of frost was. This, haha, he's not the exclusive disciple of the old man. It's hard to say, hard to say. Daisakong stroked his beard proudly with an unfathomable look. In his heart, he thought, Li Chuji is really a demon who hides his brilliance. I wonder how many lifetime zine of the Kunlun Sea has accumulated to get such a junior. It's hard for the Kunlun Sea not to rise in the future. Unfortunately, he was not Daisakong's disciple. His body movement is indeed unique and very exquisite, but it's just a body movement. If he could really take Luo Xianzi's sword head-on, he wouldn't have kept dodging. At this time, a strange voice sounded in the training hall. It was Nangong Miao of the South Yard. He looked at the battle in the sky and admitted that Qin Hao's body movement was good, but he didn't think highly of it and guessed that he would still lose. You're always right. What glanced at Nangong Miao coldly? Was he qualified to evaluate the battle between Qin Hao and Loi? Why don't you look at yourself? Where's your courage? It seems that compared to that night, you have no courage now. Take out your sword. You can't avoid the battle like this. Loi shouted. The two were trapped here, suppressed by the Divine Lord and 4 desolate ancient god pillars. There was no time limit for this battle. They could only leave after the winner was decided. What night? I never had that night with you. You don't need to worry about your reputation, but I still want to be pure. Qin Hao swore to the heavens that he didn't see anything in the eastern celestial heaven. He was a true gentleman. You're full of nonsense. Loi was referring to the battle that night, and nothing else. Moreover, he had peaked, but he still refused to accept it. This kind of character was not worthy of the strength he should have. Boom! Her heart was filled with anger. Frost flowed rapidly, and the sword momentum increased sharply. It was like a snowstorm that buried heaven and earth. The high platform was completely covered. I'm also someone with a temper. Qin Hao stopped his fleet-foot stride. His seemingly thin and tall body exploded with an extremely violent sword will. A powerful force swept out, and the frost near him was all pushed back. Countless sword shadows shot out from Qin Hao's position, turning into a rain of swords that attacked Loi. Boom! 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 A series of powerful sonic booms rang out. With each boom, Loi's body would take a step back. Blood seemed to surge up from her chest, causing her face to turn red. What a shocking sword momentum. The thousands of sword cultivators below sucked in a breath of cold air. Loi was actually forced to continuously retreat. The battle was beginning to tilt in favor of the silver-haired man. You can't face him head-on because your movement technique is good? The successor of the Thunder Clan glanced at Nangong Miao. Some people are blind, but their hearts are as clear as a mirror. There are also some people who seem to have bright eyes, but are actually blind. Shangguan Xing has said. Nangong Miao's expression changed slightly. He took a few steps forward, and the divine Tao heavenly wheel vaguely appeared on his body. The successor of the Thunder Clan and Shangguan Xinghe were both people who represented the strongest plane in the Seamless Realm. They took a few steps forward towards Nangong Miao. Although the particles flowing around them belonged to the Emperor's Nirvana realm, their auras were infinitely close to the Divine Gate. The embryonic form of their divine was very strong. They already had the qualifications to break through to the Heavenly Wheel realm. You should be glad that I didn't break through before the Sword Conference, Shangguan Xinghe said coldly. He suppressed himself at the limit of Nirvana realm because he wanted to take first place in the Emperor's path of the West Sword Field. In the end, he encountered Wuk. It was Shangguan Xinghe's misfortune. However, what he meant was that if he entered the East Sword Field after forging his divine Tao Heavenly Wheel, he would really look down on Nangong Miao. Don't provoke them. Ancestor Shangguan and Ancestor Thunder Clan are both people who can compete with the headmaster. Cheng Huai transmitted to Nangong Miao. Nangong Miao's heart trembled slightly. Only then did he retract his divine will. At this moment, an incomparably dense sword Dao Qi flow sound came from above. Those flying shadows were incomparably beautiful and pleasing to the eye. Everyone could faintly sense an endless sharpness from them. What a terrifying sword qi! This person is definitely an extraordinary sword god. Not only is his movement technique profound and unfathomable, even the power of his sword Tao is so terrifying. He shouldn't be someone from our seamless realm. Yes, they seem to be from the outside world. They are currently guests in Senior Seekong's West Capital. I really didn't expect that other than Lu Qiu and Long Miao of the Great Dao Sword Realm, I would be able to see such an outstanding sword Dao cultivator. I almost thought that he was Lu Qiu. The sword cultivators in the training hall were discussing animatedly. They had a very high evaluation of the battle in the sky, especially Qin Hao. He was originally an unknown person, but the sword Dao he displayed was actually so powerful. Hearing everyone's discussion, Nangong Miao felt very uncomfortable. He stared at Qin Hao's figure. It was hard for him to associate this person in front of him with the scoundrel of the Big Dipper Mountain who wasn't good at the sword Dao. Why? He really didn't understand. Fairy, your strength seems to have weakened. Are you hungry? Why don't we all go home and have a good meal? Wouldn't that be great? Qin Hao shouted at Loi. He was the one who created this startling sword art. As his level and comprehension increased, the Emperor-grade sword skill had evolved into a divine-grade sword skill. Shut your mouth. Loi formed a sword seal with her palm. The great Tao in her body rumbled, and the surging sword roared. Beams of frost rapidly overlapped, and thousands of ice flowers gathered into a sword. It transformed into a bright moonlight that wanted to destroy the world. This move again. That night in the eastern immortal sky, Qin Hao had received it once. Chapter 2069. Stepping forward, Qin Hao pointed his sword at the void. Divine will burst out from his body, and the space suppressed by the four ancient divine pillars resonated. Wisps of pure spatial sword will gather toward him. Borrowing sword from the heavens, break. He pointed his sword, finger forward, and a dazzling sword shadow condensed. The sword in the sky whistled and collided with bright moon's divine light. Terrifying, surging waves of light swept across the bodies of the two people. Qin Hao and Loi groaned at the same time. Faint traces of blood flowed from the corners of their mouths. Their feet slid backward uncontrollably. Heavenly wheel! Luo, he shouted, her eyes burning with an inextinguishable madness. Her black hair fluttered in the wind, and a resplendent moon appeared, overlapping with her body. Holy divine power stretched out like meridians, covering her body endlessly. At this moment, Loi's aura exploded to the limit. The coldness she emitted seemed to be able to freeze the space. Boom! Raging flames erupted from Qin Hao's body. The blood-red flames were like the torch of a demon god. The tyrannical burning power made the space sizzle. Looking over, wisps of white smoke floated all over the void platform. Flames. He's also good at the divine flames of the Great Path. The two of them are too strong. The battle began to heat up. The battle between Qin Hao and Loi evolved from a spectator to a terrifying battle. It brought a strong impact to the countless spectators below. The intensity of this battle surpassed any battle in the eastern and western sword fields. At this moment, Nangong Miao's heart was also slightly shaken. At present, the aura released by Qin Hao had exceeded the limit of his ability. If he were to collide with Qin Hao inside, he would not be a match for him. Fighting divine body. Qin Hao's long hair danced in the wind as he circulated the Nine Palace War Emperor art all over his body. Intense golden light burst out from his major acupoints one after another. 9 rays of golden light intersected, and an imposing shadow of the battle god whizzed out from his body. It was like a giant standing in the 9 heavens, extremely domineering. Xiaohan raised her head and watched quietly. The red lotus divine flame and the power of the 9 palaces were unleashed at the same time. Qin Hao was going all out, unleashing at least 50% of his battle prowess. There were not many people who could fight him to this extent. Loi was truly powerful, not losing out to any man. At this moment, Xiaohan actually felt a sense of inferiority. Compared to Loi, her cultivation was insignificant. She could no longer stand beside Qin Hao and share his burden. In comparison, Loy was more compatible with Qin Hao. Boom! Qin Hao punched forward, and the shadow of the battle god followed his movements. When this punch was unleashed, the sky was filled with blood and fire, and the space was densely shattered. Loy's heavenly wheel of the divine path revolved, and frost formed a thick ice wall in front of her. It faced the power of the Nine Palaces head-on. Although the ice wall was destroyed by the flaming fist, the frost did not dissipate. How troublesome! Qin Hao secretly gritted his teeth in the shadow of the battle god. The immortal realm was indeed not something a cat or a dog could compare with. If he did not release the heavenly wheel, it would be difficult for him to break through the opponent's defenses. Naturally, he would not be able to win. Are you still not going to use your full strength? Loy shouted. He looked down on her so much that she would not even release the heavenly wheel. I can't shake the fairy's heavenly wheel, and you can't do anything to me. In that case, why don't we end this battle with a draw? Qin Hao said. You really look down on me. Luo, he was furious. She spread out her arms and slowly raised them up. The bright moon divine light on her body shone brightly, and the sound of ice forming could be heard continuously. She actually radiated out a huge illusion of a goddess, holding an ice and snow divine sword, enveloping her within. Buzz! The majestic chill swept through, invading the soul and freezing the bone marrow. In an instant, Qin Hao felt his blood flow slow down, and the fire of the red lotus weakened in front of the goddess of ice. The sense of crisis rose wildly, and the balance of the battle was faintly tilted towards Loy. Qin Hao's eyes suddenly opened, and the flame patterns climbed up his eyes as if they had penetrated the frost divine will. His gaze passed through the shadow of the goddess and pierced Loy's body. The sleeping dragon power in his body awakened, and the dragon soul swam in his meridians. As Qin Hao slightly held his breath, between heaven and earth, an extremely violent dragon roar burst out, shaking the universe. The raging turbulence swept through and made people unable to open their eyes. The sound wave actually passed through the blockade of the four pillars and spread to the outside world. The dragon roar turned the universe upside down. True dragon roar. This is the dragon roar divine technique, the true dragon roar of the dragon clan. He's from the true dragon sword realm. Countless people felt their blood boil from the roar. They were shocked, and their eyes were filled with shock. At this time, Loy was once again attacked by the true dragon roar, and her mind was in chaos. The frost divine will stagnated, and a loophole appeared in her will. Qin Hao's 10,000 spirit fire eyes flashed, and he found the loophole. The battle divine body stepped forward and punched out. With a boom, it hit the huge shadow of the goddess. Crack! The crystalline goddess, who was like an ice sculpture, was covered in cracks. Countless tiny pieces fell off, and the fist force mixed with the red lotus divine fire penetrated Luo Yi's body. It pierced into her frost divine intent, making her feel incomparably uncomfortable. Loy was caught by Qin Hao when she was in a trance. Ice and fire could not be merged, and at this moment, when Qin Hao's red lotus divine will hid in her frost, she felt as if she was being hung on a cross and being roasted by raging flames. Her whole body was in extreme pain. Let's stop here. It's a draw. As Qin Hao withdrew the battle divine fist, the ice sculpture of the goddess collapsed. He did not want to expose all his cards, and there was no need to fight with Loy as if they were mortal enemies. After all, he did not want to become a disciple of the academy, and this action had encouraged Wuk to forge a sword. As if she had been humiliated, Loy raised her head and screamed. As her voice rang out, the ancient divine pillars that suppressed the four corners of the high platform in the void began to ripple with divine light. The turbulent aura of the divine will began to rush out from the ancient divine patterns on the pillars, rushing wildly toward Loy. It wasn't just that. A strand of the might of the heavens descended from the boundless sky, and it transformed into a divine river of Tao insight that was visible to the naked eye. It cleansed Luo Yi's body, and her imposing aura broke through her shackles and became even more terrifying than before. It was like she carried some sort of unparalleled force. The power of the realm. Countless people felt the descent of the heavenly might. This was not a simple heavenly might, but the power of the realm of the great path. Only the ruler of the realm of the gods could mobilize it. In other words, this was the power of the Divine Master. The Divine Master of Avicii obviously could not interfere, but at this moment, the power of the realm appeared on Loi's body, and immediately thousands of people were terrified. Even the giants of the divine realm were stunned and did not dare to breathe. How is this possible? Qin Hao was extremely shocked. Loi had used the power of the world of Avicii. How had she done it? Even an immortal-level heavenly wheel could not casually use the power of the Divine Master's realm. No matter how outstanding Loi's talent was, her cultivation would not be able to withstand the power of the sword god of Avicii. And yet, such a bizarre and strange thing was happening right before his eyes. Qin Hao vaguely remembered that when Loi had stimulated the sword As Pagoda, the power of the realm had also appeared when she comprehended the final sword. At the time, he had not paid too much attention to it. Like everyone else, he had thought that it might have alarmed the Divine Master of Avicii. But now, it seemed that this was not the case. This was clearly Loi herself using the power of the realm. Could it be that she actually had a perfect heavenly wheel? There was no time to think. When the power of the realm bathed Loi's body, the ancient divine will within the 4 desolate god pillars was constantly being absorbed by her. The power she was emitting was enough to bring about a life-or-death crisis for Qin Hao. Almost subconsciously, a dim light of the wheel appeared beneath Qin Hao's body. The light grew more and more dazzling, as if it would burst out at any moment. It released a perfect great Tao to resist the pressure brought about by Loi. That's enough. A calm voice carried with it an unparalleled majesty. A ray of sword light shot out from the depths of the academy, transforming into a hazy face that towered between the heavens and the earth. Instantly, the power of the realm that had suddenly appeared dissipated in front of this face. The 4 desolate god pillars that had sealed Qin Hao transformed into rays of light that flew away. The seal had been lifted. The boundless divine will that had surged towards Loi was suddenly sucked away. She seemed to have lost all of her strength in an instant. All of her brilliance disappeared, and her face turned pale. Even her hovering body felt somewhat weak. But invisibly, there was another power that was supporting her, preventing her from making a fool of herself in front of everyone. All living beings of the seamless world greet the Divine Lord. Countless people bowed deeply, paying their respects to the face in the 9 heavens. This was the strongest sword god of the seamless world, the ruler of an entire world. Now, he had personally come out to end the conflict between the juniors of the Western capital and the Eastern immortal heaven. Young Master. Daisakong raised his head and looked at the ball of light floating in the void. Although it was hazy and he couldn't see the features clearly, the young master's appearance had always been engraved in his heart. Since the creation of the seamless world, many geniuses of the sword Tao have appeared. The Thunder Continent, the Yuluo Continent, the Turbid Continent, the Shangwan Clan, and so on. Today, in the Sword Conference of the Academy, the 6 Doyens and I have all seen your performances. We're deeply gratified. From the hazy ball of light, the voice of the Divine Lord of Seamless rang out. Instantly, the expressions of the Thunder Continent, the Yuluo, Divine Grandson, Shangwan Xinghe, and the others turned solemn. To be called out by the Divine Lord was an incomparable honor. The manpower of the Academy is limited. We are unable to give everyone the time to teach. No matter who enters or fails this time, don't be arrogant or discouraged. Many of you come from large clans, and the abilities of your elders are also qualified to teach you the Tao of the future. The Divine Lord of Seamless said. Everyone knew that it was time to announce the results of the Sword Conference. They couldn't help but feel uneasy, even though many of them knew that if nothing unexpected happened, it should be those few people. Showuck of the Western Sword Field, Li Guangxing of the Eastern Sword Field, Loi of the Eastern Sword Field. The Divine Lord read out the names. Yes, the three of them replied loudly. After the sword conference, stay in the academy. The Divine Lord of Seamless said. Yes, the three of them nodded. And you, the Divine Lord of Seamless, who had transformed into a hazy ball of light, turned his hazy face slightly in the direction of Qin Hao. You also stay in the academy. Me? Qin Hao was stunned. All right. He didn't want to participate in the sword conference, nor did he say that he would enter. However, staying in the academy to cultivate wasn't a bad idea. He could practice the sword Dao with Wuk. There were many miracles in the academy that could temper his sword Dao. Moreover, he would have the opportunity to cultivate some powerful killing sword techniques. This brat. Daisakong looked unhappy. He clasped his hands behind his back. The young master had personally asked Li Chuji to stay, but he seemed to be unwilling. He really didn't know how lucky he was. As expected, there are 4 disciples of the academy. That silver-haired swordsman has also been chosen by the Divine Lord. There were people in the training grounds who were surprised, and there were also people who were worried. It was inevitable that Wu Kei and the other 2 would be chosen, but Qin Hao was an exception. He had appeared out of nowhere, and if he hadn't battled with Luo Xianzi, it was likely that no one would have known of his existence. Sigh, it seems that we'll have to wait countless years for the next sword conference. Shangwan Xinghe shook his head, feeling unhappy. The successor of the Laming clan, Yuluo Shunzuan, also felt a little disappointed. However, they were born at the wrong time, and their skills were not as good as others. If they hadn't met Wuk, they might have been one of the disciples who entered the academy. What a pity. Not only were the heirs of the major clans disappointed, but also Bidu Yi and Nangong Miao of the Southern Academy. At this moment, Nangong Miao's mood was very complicated. He seemed to have lost his sharpness, standing in the crowd with his head lowered. Chapter 2070. Wulin Chinese Network Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The Sword Elders of the Divine World gather. There's always someone who likes to show off. Once he achieves something, he'll wave his flag and gain attention. Usually, those who are unknown are the easiest to ignore. This was what Qin Hao had said at Beta Mountain. There was no absolute conclusion about who was strong or weak. Being strong at one time might not always be strong. Perhaps someone would surpass him later. This meant that Wuk's talent was no weaker than Nangong Miao's. At that time, Nangong Miao didn't think much of it. Now that he thought about it, it was ironic. Today, he had completely lost. Not only did he lose the sword in his hand, but he also lost the Dao in his heart. At that time, he had boasted that he could compete with Lu Qiu and Long Miao. In the end, the sword competition shattered his fantasy. How many of the sword cultivators here today could defeat Nangong Miao? He couldn't defeat Loi's sword. The beautiful woman and Li Guangxing were all stronger than him. Even the Laming clan successor of the Western Sword Field, Shangwan Xinghe, Yuluo Divine Grandson, and Beidi's cousin, would have the qualifications to suppress Nangong Miao once they completed their heavenly wheels and stepped into the divine path. No matter how proud he was, his talent couldn't be compared to others. Congratulations. The immortal divine god, secluded spring sect master, supreme god soaring cloud, spiritual master Xuani, and many other powerful figures in front of the divine palace congratulated Fairy Qingrong and Daisakong. These 2 had been chosen by the academy to become disciples. Ha ha ha. Wuk and Chu San aren't sword cultivators of the Western capital. They're just guests in my residence, Daisakong said modestly. Although he said this, he was very happy inside. His gaze shifted towards Dean Nan. At this time, Dean Nan's face was gloomy. He didn't say a word in the crowd, as if he had aged a lot. Dean, Nangong Miao is a seedling worth nurturing. But he's too arrogant and thinks too highly of himself, to the point that he doesn't consider the consequences of his words and actions. Let this sword competition be a lesson for him. Daisakong, Nin said as he patted Dean Nan's shoulder. Sigh, Nangong Miao Miao, Diaz indeed overstepped his boundaries and sunk into his ego, believing himself to be unparalleled in the world. In fact, the first person he lost to was himself. Headmaster Nan sighed. Nan Gongxiong had been born with a good background, and he had always trained by his side. This made Headmaster Nan feel as though Nan Gongxiong was a blessed child of the heavens who should shoulder the shoulders of the rising pillars of the seamless realm and view himself as Lucio. Little did he know that he was different from Lucio. There was no need for him to set harsh requirements. Instead, those lofty ideals and illusory goals made him gradually lose himself. The big shots of the divine realm were discussing things here. Everyone sympathized with Dinan's feelings, but they could also understand. At this moment, the Master God's will, who had transformed into a ball of light, silently looked at a certain spot in the void and said, "Since you're here, let the juniors of the God realm see me." As the Divine Master's voice fell, a powerful and dazzling divine splendor of the great path shone in that direction. A celestial figure full of majesty appeared. As it gradually solidified, the radiance it emitted revealed a myriad of charm. It was dignified, holy, and unstoppable. It was the second strongest person in the infinite divine realm, the Eastern Victory Immortal, whose status was comparable to the purple flower heavenly centipede. Immortal. Daisakong and the others looked up. "Greetings, Senior Immortal." Countless swordsmen bowed. "Master." Qing Rong called out softly with a smile on her face. The Eastern Victory Immortal nodded slightly at the crowd. His noble figure stood beside the ball of light that the Divine Lord of Infinity had transformed into. There is only one person reflected in his eyes, Loy of the Eastern Deity Heaven. "You speak," the Eastern Victory Immortal said. The Divine Lord of Infinity's hazy face smiled. He spoke loudly to the thousands of swordsmen of the divine realm. "Today, the might of the Great Path has descended twice at the Academy Sword Conference. I believe that you are all very curious about Loy." The crowd looked at each other. They were indeed filled with curiosity. Because the might of the Great Path had been poured into Luo Xianzi, how could she use the power of the Great Path? "She is the daughter of Dongsheng and me," the Divine Lord of Infinity said. Boom! His words caused a huge commotion. The thousands of swordsmen were all deeply shocked. That's right. Loy is indeed the daughter of Infinity and me. The Eastern Victory Immortal admitted it personally, completely dispelling the suspicions in the crowd's hearts. No wonder her swordsmanship is so strong. No one can match Luo Xianzi's sword. She also has the divine decree of frost. Bright moon life spirit, celestial wheel. Every characteristic has the shadow of the Divine Lord and the Celestial Lord. This can explain why she can summon the might of the Great Path. Luo Xianzi is the blood of the Divine Lord. The shock in their hearts could not be quelled. The thousands of swordsmen knew that for all these years, the Divine Lord had no children. It was also because of this that compared to the other two sword realms, the infinite realm always lacked something. But now, the Divine Lord had a child. She was alive and standing in front of everyone, sparring with thousands of swordsmen. Her talent and strength were so strong that she almost swept the entire Eastern sword field. She was peerless. Thinking of this, countless swordsmen felt relieved. Since she was the beloved daughter of the Divine Lord and the Celestial Lord, she should have a stunning performance. Otherwise, how could she be worthy of her noble birth? Losing to Loy was not shameful. It was natural that they could not even withstand a single strike from her. But all of a sudden, a sense of shock rose in the hearts of many people, and they subconsciously looked at Qin Hao in the Western Capitals group. Thousands of swordsmen could not withstand a single strike from Loy. Everyone felt that it was natural. Even the transcendental disciples of the Academy paled in comparison to Loy. But what about the silver-haired youth from the Western capital? This fellow had fought the daughter of a divine master to a standstill. He had crossed the frost glory divine intent and remained undefeated. The more they thought about it, the more terrified they felt. One could imagine how strong Qin Hao was. Moreover, on the high platform in the sky, Qin Hao seemed to be holding back. After all, he had not used the celestial wheel. If he had used the celestial wheel just now, what would have happened? The more they thought about it, the more terrified they became. No one dared to continue thinking about it. At this moment, Loi was also very excited. Her eyes were slightly red. She had waited for this day for too long. It had been thousands of years. She had always wanted to know about her birth and her family. Her master had told her that she would understand when she entered the academy. During this period, Loi had barged into the academy more than once. Every time, she would be stopped by the realm aura. Until one day, she broke through the realm aura's shackles and stood in the academy. She was only one step away from meeting the divine lord of Avicii. But it was enough for her to understand something. Her birth was related to the sword god of Avicii. Now, she had the answer she wanted to know even in her dreams. She was the daughter of the sword god of Avicii, the princess of the realm of gods. Not only that, the master who had taught her since she was a child was her mother. That girl is crying. What nudged Qin Hao? Loi could cry. What does it have to do with me? Qin Hao's expression was cold. Then, he smiled at Xiao Han and held his wife's hand. In this sword conference, the elders and I saw the future of the god realm. If we want to revive the sword Tao of Avicii, we have a long way to go. It is not a matter of one master, one person, and one sword. Whether the Avicii realm can continue to stand tall in the wilderness and become the god realm of the sword Tao depends on your performance. I hope that after today's sword conference, more geniuses will emerge from the various planes, said the divine lord of Avicii. We will not disappoint the divine lord. We will work hard to cultivate the sword, everyone shouted. Just don't disappoint yourselves. Apart from that, the ancient void mirage will be open to the public. Those who want to enter can go directly to the western capital after leaving the academy. Daisakong will send people to arrange it. This can be considered a reward for you, ordered the divine lord of Avicii. In an instant, the hearts of thousands of sword cultivators trembled. It was said that the ancient void mirage was one of the sources of power that supported the Avicii realm. It was controlled by the divine lord himself. Ordinary people could not enter. Only the big shots of the god realm and the god ancestors of the various planes had the qualifications to enter. Moreover, those who came out of the ancient void mirage in the past were all much stronger and had powerful ancient divine artifacts. To the western capital, the Yuluo divine clan's group bowed respectfully to the divine lord, then turned around and left the academy. The Shangguan clan, the Laming clan, and many other powerful clans did the same. The beautiful woman who lost to Li Guangxing was the first to leave. With the opening of the ancient void mirage, none of the sword cultivators of the Avicii realm wanted to miss this opportunity. It might change their lives. If their luck was good enough, they might be able to find a supreme opportunity. Waves of people flowed out of the academy. Using his will, he could sense that they were all heading towards the western capital. The sword god of Avicii naturally didn't need to care. He spoke to the Dao Plaza. Everyone disperse. There are some dangers in the ancient void mirage. I hope that you all know your limits. The few of you follow me. The divine lords will sweep past Qin Hao, Wuk, Li Guangxing, Loi, and the others. A blurry ball of light soared into the air, flying towards the depths of the academy. The sword god of Avicii has summoned you. The doyens are all waiting. Don't be rude. Daisakong shouted to Qin Hao and the others. After that, he turned to the Dongsheng Immortal Sovereign, North Star Celestial Sovereign, Headmaster Nan, and the other major powers. Supreme Pavilion, let's go together. Supreme Pavilion was the place where the divine lord of Avicii cultivated. Please. Everyone modestly declined. They turned into beams of light and followed the divine lord. Chu San, Wuk, you guys go with Li Guangxing and Luo Xinzi. I'll go back to the western capital first. Divine Lord Xin, you guys go back with me first, Zhang said. The ancient void mirage had opened. He had already received Daisakong's message. He needed to lead the guards there to maintain order. Okay. Xin nodded. He turned to Qin Hao and said, Go quickly. Okay. Qin Hao replied. He turned into beams of light with Wuk and the others and disappeared into the void behind the sacred hall. Brother Chu-san, wait for me. Si Huan pretended to go as well. Young Master Si, don't cause trouble. Zhang De grabbed Si Huan's arm. How am I causing trouble? My father, my grandfather, and the Divine Lord are all here. I'm not an outsider. Si Huan objected. Wasn't the academy his second home? Zhang De ignored him and directly dragged him out, returning to the western capital. Supreme Pavilion. They were seated in the deepest part of the academy, on top of a mountain. The surrounding area was filled with birds and flowers. The endless world was different from Rikujinji and the true dragon world. Those were countries with divine authority, but this was a country with orthodoxy. Even though he was a divine lord, the sword god of Avicii didn't build any luxurious palaces. Everything he did seemed very casual and natural. At this moment, Qin Hao and the others followed the major powers of the deity world to the Supreme Pavilion. After entering, they were stunned by the atmosphere before them. The Dongsheng Immortal Sovereign, North Star Celestial, Daisakong, Headmaster Nan. Not only were the major powers of the deity realm and the unaging divine lord present, there were also 6 incomparably powerful figures present. Each of them exuded an incomparably ancient aura. Among them, Qin Hao had seen Sword God Severing Love before. You've all come. An extremely tall and majestic old man with white hair and beard spoke to the major powers of the deity realm. This person was extremely tall, taller than Qin Hao by a head. His gaze seemed calm, but as long as one looked into his eyes, one would feel as though they were being pierced by 2 rays of sword light. Gu Zun, North Star Celestial, and the others bowed slightly. The leader of the 6 founding elders, Gu Zun, had the highest cultivation in the endless world. He had 2 more marks than the divine Lord of Ichi. Back then, the 7 of them met and became sworn brothers. Gu Zun was the elder brother of Sword God of Ichi. His status in the deity realm was extremely high. Greetings, founding elders and seniors. Qin Hao and the others hurriedly bowed. Little fellows, you fought pretty well. We all saw it very carefully, especially you. Ha ha ha. An old blind man with a black cloth over his eyes and a face full of wrinkles pointed at Qin Hao and laughed heartily. Based on his actions, those who didn't know better would think that this old man wasn't blind. I used all my skills and fought very hard. My performance was really not worth mentioning. Qin Hao leaned slightly and lowered his posture as he spoke respectfully to the old man. Through the power of the origin realm, he could sense that this old blind senior's sword intent was terrifyingly powerful. It was even stronger than the founding elder with the highest body. Only in front of the Tao of Divine Lord of Ichi did it seem slightly suppressed. This was a heavenly wheel expert whose strength was infinitely close to the Divine Lord. This old blind man gave Qin Hao his first impression. Chapter 2071. Elders were gathered in the Supreme Tower, each of them shockingly powerful. They were the pillars of the seamless world, and Qin Hao could not fight against any one of them. He remembered that when he had just entered the divine realm, a strand of the great sea combs had pressured him, and it was enough to make it difficult for Qin Hao to move an inch. Now, Senior Seekong's strength was at the bottom of the hierarchy among the magnates, and he was only slightly stronger than the immortal divine Venerable and the others. How could he not be shocked? If your performance is not worth mentioning, then the tens of thousands of seamless sword cultivators today are nothing. If they heard this, they would be ashamed. Blind Sword Sovereign smiled. Yes, where do you place us? Loi was dissatisfied. Qin Hao had forced her to use her full strength without even releasing his heavenly wheel. If this was not worth mentioning, then what was her performance? This silver-haired guy was bullying her. Kid, being too humble is hypocritical. The stooped grass Sword Sovereign said. Cough, cough. Senior is right. Qin Hao was slightly embarrassed. He couldn't praise himself, right? Wouldn't that make him seem like a hypocrite like Nangong Miao? Today is the first time the Academy has opened a sword conference to the public. The performances of the Eastern and Western sword fields are remarkable, shocking us old fellows who live in seclusion. Gu Jinzuan was gratified. Not only was Qin Hao outstanding, But the other three geniuses who were selected to enter the academy also had their own unique areas. Wuck's sword intent was extremely high, Li Guanxing was calm and experienced, and Loi was even more so. She had the bloodline of a divine master, and she fully displayed her sharpness. So, the divine realm should hold more sword conferences like this. This will encourage sword cultivators to work hard. A white-clothed figure stepped into the Supreme Tower. His aura was otherworldly, shocking everyone. Divine Master, immortal divine deity, and the others bowed slightly. Young Master. Daisakong hurriedly stood beside Sword God of Ichi. His honest appearance made him look like a servant serving his master. It was hard to associate him with the king of the West Capital. Junior greets the Divine Master. Wuck and the others hurriedly saluted. Qin Hao looked over. God Lord of Ichi's appearance was that of an extremely handsome middle-aged man. From his facial features, it wasn't hard to imagine how handsome and elegant he had been in his youth. But his aura wasn't as refined as that of his senior apprentice brother Zine. He exuded an unparalleled sharpness, as if nothing in the universe could stop him. Senior seamless. Qin Hao cupped his hands as his emotions surged. This was the strongest divine Tao he had encountered since leaving the divine wilderness. He was even stronger than the god of the East. To be able to fight evenly with my daughter, boy, you're not simple. Divine Lord of Ichi pointed at Qin Hao and smiled. Next, his gaze shifted to the Eastern Victory Immortal Sovereign. The two of them looked at each other and nodded slightly. They still maintained a distance from each other and didn't act intimately, as everyone had imagined. They felt as though they were just ordinary friends, or even slightly more polite. Qin Hao looked at the Divine Master and the Immortal Sovereign. He felt strange. This shouldn't be the case. The Immortal Sovereign and I are very good friends. Divine Lord of Ichi seemed to have seen through Qin Hao's doubts. Friends. Qin Hao was stunned. Everyone was also stunned. Was that all? Young Master, what's going on? Daisakong asked with concern. Divine Lord of Ichi took a deep breath and glanced at Loi. He said slowly, "Back then, I took my own blood essence and a wisp of the Immortal Sovereign's soul essence. I infused it with the power of the great world to mold it into an embryo spirit. It was sealed in the Eastern deity's divine ice and nurtured for thousands of years. That was how Loi was born. Loi had his blood flowing in her veins. She also had the soul power of the Immortal Sovereign. She was indeed their child. But Divine Lord of Ichi and the Eastern Victory Immortal Sovereign were not husband and wife. As he said, they were just friends." I see. Everyone suddenly understood. They had thought that the Divine Lord and the Immortal Sovereign had become Tao companions in private. They had been wondering why the Divine Lord and the Immortal Sovereign had become Tao companions without a public ceremony. They didn't expect that it was just an ordinary relationship. "Young Master, why is that?" Daisakong asked anxiously. He glanced at the Immortal Sovereign. Young Master was the lord of a realm and the strongest sword god. The Immortal Sovereign was a peerless beauty. Both of them had immortal-grade heavenly wheels. When they stood together, they looked like a match made in heaven. Unfortunately, they weren't. "Sikong, you don't have to worry about it. It's actually quite good for them to be like this," Sword Lord Gu said and looked at everyone. As everyone knows, the foundation of our seamless realm is weak. Whether it is the quantity or quality of our sword cultivators, we are inferior to Rikujinji and True Dragon Sword Realm. Under God, Lu, and Dragon Lord, we have Lu Qiu, Long Miao, and the other princes and princesses with powerful bloodlines. In the long run, the gap between the peak bloodlines of the three realms will grow bigger and bigger. In the end, it will reach an extreme level of prosperity and decline. In order to chase the footsteps of the two sword realms, Divine Lord of Ichi and the Immortal Sovereign made this decision. When Sword Lord Gu said this, he looked meaningfully at Loi and said, "Child, you were born to compete with Lu Qiu and Long Miao. The burden you bear is extremely heavy." This was the meaning of Loi's birth. Her existence was to compete with the successors of Rikujinji and True Dragon Clan. Otherwise, Sword Lord of Ichi couldn't find a talent who could match her. Like Nangong Miao, was he worthy? However, plans couldn't keep up with changes. Originally, Sword Lord Avicii and the immortal sovereign had planned for thousands of years to create the best bloodline. In the end, after a sword competition, an extraordinary monster Qin, Hao who could match Loi appeared. Other than that, there was also Wuk and Li Guangxing. Both of them had exceeded the expectations of God Master Avicii and the elders. With this group of fresh blood joining them, they would have a much higher chance of fighting against the world of the gods and the true dragon race in the future. At the very least, they would not be completely defeated and could still put up a fight. Am I just the meaning of my existence? Loi let out a bitter laugh. In the hands of Sword Lord Avicii and the immortal sovereign, was she a puppet or a tool? No, Yer, you have the proof of my union with Sword Lord Avicii. You are our real flesh and blood. Don't think about other things. Dongsheng, immortal sovereign, held Loi's hand. Although she wasn't Sword God Avicii's wife, Loi was their child. For thousands of years, every day and night, she had been waiting for the baby's spirit in the ice. The process was more difficult than 10 months of pregnancy in the mortal world. Senior Avicii, why are you competing with God Lu and Dragon Lord? Qin Hao interrupted. He could understand the original intention of Sword God Avicii and Dongsheng, immortal sovereign. Creating a god. Back in the divine wilderness continent, the divine palace wanted to create a god. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed for many generations. Zhan Wu had silently protected him for 3 generations in order to urge him to become a god. Even the evil spirits in the divine wilderness wanted to become a god. But Qin Hao couldn't understand one thing. Why did Sword God Avicii view God, Lu, and Dragon Lord as opponents? Could it be that there was an irreconcilable grudge between the 3 of them? Must it be passed on to future generations? According to legend, at the beginning of the primordial world, during the era of the ancient gods, countless formidable god kings that could destroy the heavens and the earth appeared. They could easily annihilate numerous divine worlds with a single move of theirs, causing countless planes to vanish. Amongst them was a sword god king that possessed innate sword energy. Divine Lord Avicii didn't explain Qin Hao's question. Instead, he talked about the age of ancient gods. That was an extremely chaotic and bloody period. Because at the beginning of their birth, no one had Tao. Naturally, there was no compassion, benevolence, kindness, or the human heart. They only had tyrannical strength. As long as they wanted something, they would use force to seize it. When the divine kings fought, the great Tao Star universe was destroyed. The Sword God King was one of the ancient divine kings who fell. Divine Lord Avicii said. Everyone was horrified. Although they hadn't experienced the age of ancient gods, they could imagine the horror of the battle between the god kings. That kind of destruction could easily make countless god worlds and planes disappear. Billions of lives were lost. What does this have to do with the 3 great sword realms? Qin Hao didn't understand. Of course it does. Sword God of Avicii looked at Qin Hao solemnly and said, Sword God King has fallen. His divine soul was dispelled by an extremely powerful divine king using the Dharma, and his divine body was shattered into pieces. However, a small part of his will of Tao was left behind, which escaped his opponent's perception and drifted away in the untainted land. Could it be? Wuk was shocked. Yes, the 3 great sword worlds are the areas enveloped by the Sword God King's Tao insight. Every single piece of land, every single river, and even every single speck of dust here contains the tendons, flesh, and blood of the Sword God King, and everything about him when he was alive. Avicii was extremely solemn. In fact, the reason why Wu Jian was able to reach his current level of cultivation was because he happened to obtain a broken bone of a divine king by chance. The powerful sword intent of the bone cleansed his body, causing his celestial wheel to mutate and his sword intent to become even stronger. When his sword will radiated, the dust was infected and gave birth to the spirit of heavenly Tao. It evolved into continents and finally formed the sword world. Not only him, Avicii guessed that God Lu and Dragon Master must have also obtained something left behind by Sword God King. That was why they could support a world. In fact, the three great sword realms were originally one. That was Sword God King himself. If they wanted to reappear at the peak of the ancient sword Tao, the three great sword realms must merge. This was the goal of Sword God Avicii and immortal venerable Dong Sheng, to create a god. They needed a qualified person to inherit everything of Sword God King. We can't imagine how strong Sword God King was when he was at his peak. But if the God King who killed him knows about this, how can our three great sword realms exist? Sword Lord Gu said, although they didn't participate in the grudge between the ancient gods and didn't want to get involved, the three great sword realms would definitely be destroyed by the other party. This was beyond doubt. So, Avicii, God Lu, and Dragon Master made an agreement. The three great sword realms will hold a sword battle and choose the most talented descendant of the three god lords. By infusing the three great sword realms with the power of the three great sword realms, the Sword God King's Tao will be forcefully infused into the successor, creating a great miracle. Sword Lord Gu said, "Create a God King." Qin Hao's eyes widened. Everyone's hearts were in turmoil. We don't know who killed Sword God King, and we don't know when that day will repeat itself in the three great sword realms. In order to prevent the great sword realm from being destroyed, we can only fight with all our strength. Sword God Avicii felt powerless. Even as a god lord of a realm, and with the power of God Lu and Dragon Master, they couldn't fight against a god king who ruled over all the realms. Unless the three great sword realms gave birth to someone who surpassed the god lord level and reappeared at the peak of the ancient sword Tao. Otherwise, tragedy was inevitable. Not just the Avicii realm, but the three great sword realms would be completely wiped out. Chapter 2072. The three sword realms originated from the Tao of the Sword God King. Just as the Divine Lord said, every continent, every river, and even every speck of dust had traces of the Sword God King. The Sword God King had fallen, so his sword Tao was naturally not allowed to exist. When that day came, the three sword realms would be destroyed. Sword God Avicii, God Lu, and Dragon Master would not be spared. The realms would be destroyed. People would also die. Even if the ancient deity king who had destroyed the Sword God King spared the lives of the three divine lords, their tens of thousands of years of cultivation, heavenly wheels, and all the divine power in their bodies would be mercilessly extracted because that was the Sword God King's Tao. Not only the three divine lords, but also the 6 elders, the 4 giants of the deity realm, and the many sword Tao masters in Rikujinji and Jinlong world would have any traces of their sword Tao erased, and they would eventually become ordinary people. It was enough to imagine that they would rather die. In the process of cultivating to the divine level, every single person here had put in a lot of sweat and suffered a lot of hardships. Qin Hao's path to becoming a divine god was extremely difficult. It was something that countless generations of people in the divine wilderness had sacrificed their lives in exchange for. On Sunset Peak, when the divine light shone, the martial arts of the entire continent were crying. Think about it. Divine Lord Avicii, Dragon Master, and God Lu would not be willing to wait for death and be destroyed. That was absolutely impossible. The deity king could destroy a world with a snap of his fingers. Instead of dying in despair, they would rather burn to their heart's content. This was the goal of the divine sword god Avicii and Dongsheng deity king. The birth of Loi was only the first step to recreating the sword god king. In the supreme tower, everyone's hearts were unusually heavy. After listening to divine Lord Avicii's words, they finally understood the hidden dangers of the sword realm. It was actually in danger of being destroyed. The battle of the ancient gods happened so long ago. Maybe they have already forgotten. Qin Hao tried to ease the atmosphere. The Sword God King had the ability to escape a wisp of sword will without being discovered. The Great Path Sword Realm might not attract the attention of the opponent. He did not want to be too worried and scare himself. Divine Lord Avicii shook his head. It will happen sooner or later. Although the sword world had always been stable and peaceful, that was because the realm spirit had been weak in the beginning. Everyone and everything in the world was improving. When the swordsmen of the Great Path Sword world were strong enough, they would definitely attract attention again. That ancient god had personally killed the Sword God King and would definitely recognize his will of way. Maybe he died long ago, just like the Sword God King. Wuk spoke. In a battle between God Kings, if things didn't go well, both sides would be heavily injured and die together. Or maybe he didn't die. Let's say he was heavily injured and coincidentally, at this moment, the other God Kings took the opportunity to act and ended him. You really know how to make things up. Qin Hao didn't realize that Wuk had such a rich imagination. Only a fool would believe you. Loi rolled her eyes at Wuk. Of course, it would be best if we perish together. However, we need to take precautions. The sword realm of the Great Path is originally one. God Lu, Dragon Master, and I have all reached the limit of our cultivation. Our swordsmanship cannot progress any further. If we can really cultivate a miracle that surpasses the almighty Master Realm, wouldn't that be a good thing for the swordsmanship and millions of swordsmen? Divine Lord Avicii felt a sense of accomplishment. Qin Hao smiled foolishly. The three divine masters had done this personally, pouring the origin sword intent of the three great sword realms into a single person's body. In theory, there was a slight possibility of creating a divine king, but that was only in theory. Would the actual process really be as smooth as the theory? Qin Hao did not have any confidence in his heart. He secretly glanced at Wuk and Luo Yi. If there was really someone among the sword cultivators who could withstand the divine king's will of the three great sword realms and not die, then this person, Wuk, was the most suitable. Qin Hao wasn't biased. Loi, Lucio, and Long Miao could be called first-rate geniuses in the primitive universe regardless of whether it was their inherited bloodline or their temperament. However, that was all. Their heavenly wheels were destined to be unable to withstand the Sword God King's will of Tao. Otherwise, why didn't Divine Lord Avicii, God Lu, and Dragon Master try it themselves? Just now, Divine Lord Avicii had said that his cultivation had reached a limit and could no longer break through from Divine Lord. The reason was none other than the grade of his heavenly wheels. The limit was right there. Wuk was different. Wuk hadn't forged his heavenly wheels yet. He had the power of the original realm and had a high chance of making his heavenly wheels perfect. Perfect heavenly wheels were the prerequisite to becoming a God King. Moreover, it was a hard requirement. Therefore, if they really wanted to create a God King, Qin Hao felt that Wuk was more qualified and more suitable than him. This was because Wuk's sword Tao was refined and pure. Of course, he couldn't say this in front of all the big shots. After all, Wuk hadn't stepped into the divine path and wouldn't believe him. Loi, now you understand what the old man said. The burden on your shoulders is very heavy. He hoped that when the sword battle came in the future, the winner would be Loi. The Sword God King came from the Avicii realm and not Rikujinji or the True Dragon tribe. Loi lowered her head slightly. At this moment, she didn't have the unparalleled sharpness that she had during the sword competition. If she didn't know anything, her beard would still be wild. However, after hearing about the origin of the Great Path Sword Realm, could she really bear the burden of the Sword Tao? The Sword God King was dead. If the ancient god who killed the Sword God King came one day, would she be able to hold the sword in her hand, protect the Tao in her heart, and protect the people around her? Loi didn't know, but when that day came, she wouldn't retreat. Even if she died, she would spill her blood in this academy. And him, Loi silently looked at Qin Hao. The silver-haired guy would probably face the future of the Great Path Sword Realm with her, as well as Wuk and Li Guangxing. Well, the future is determined by the heavens. Do what you have to do. Don't put too much pressure on the children. Divine Lord Avicii looked at Qin Hao and the others. The four of you go out and find an elder to familiarize yourself with the academy. There are many wonderful places in the academy. In a few days, I will ask Tianyang to arrange for people to guide and supervise your cultivation. Go. Yes, Wuk said respectfully. Wait. Qin Hao took a few steps forward and came before Divine Lord Avicii. Senior, I have something to ask you about a person in the Great Path Sword Realm. Who? Divine Lord Avicii asked. The martial god. Qin Hao's expression darkened. What's your relationship with the martial god? Divine Lord Avicii was slightly surprised. When he sparred with Loi, he saw the power of the 9 palaces on Qin Hao. It was the martial god's ultimate technique. It's a lost elder of mine, Qin Hao said. When I came here, I heard that he specifically challenged the famous sword gods of the Great Path Sword Realm to spar with. With your extraordinary strength, have you ever fought with a martial god? Fought? Divine Lord Avicii smiled and nodded. Yes, I did. Not only him, but God Lu and Dragon Master were also targeted by the martial god. Even the 6 elders of the Academy and the Dongsheng Immortal were not spared. The martial god, that be *starred, appeared out of nowhere and made the Great Path Sword Realm a mess. He had offended many people. Of course, there were even more people who were afraid of the martial god. Who won? Wuk was excited. The martial god, the ancestral patriarch of the Divine Palace, was the last expert to become a god at the end of the primordial spirit era in the Divine Barren Land. He was a martial artist of the Divine Barren Land. The martial god is extremely powerful and has a limitless future. As for the outcome, you don't need to know. Divine Lord Avicii said mysteriously. Sword Lord Gu, Blind Sword Lord, and Sword God, severing love, chuckled silently from afar. They had witnessed the battle between the martial god and Avicii with their own eyes. It was a wonderful battle. Unfortunately, the martial god's cultivation was too shallow. Compared to the 3 divine lords of the Great Path Sword Realm, he lacked the foundation. Otherwise, the 3 divine lords might have been defeated by him one by one. It seems that he lost. Wuk lowered his head. From the expression of Sword God Avicii, he could see that he did not want to say the outcome because he wanted to save the martial god's face. It made sense. According to the Primordial Spirit Era and the Primordial Spirit Era, the martial god ancestral patriarch only had 20,000 years of cultivation. Even if he had the power of the original realm, it was normal for him to lose to the 3 divine lords. Then how can I find him? Qin Hao asked excitedly. The martial god ancestral patriarch was indeed hiding in the Great Path Sword Realm. If he could find him, he would not have to worry about anything in the future. Divine Lord Avicii shook his head. His whereabouts are uncertain. No one knows where he is, not even me. But when the day of the sword battle between God Lu and I comes, I guess that the martial god will definitely appear. The martial god's celestial wheel was too powerful, and so was his will. It was enough to block the perception of the 3 divine lords. Every time he failed to spar with them, he would hide in some corner to cultivate. The next time he appeared, his cultivation would have improved. It was quite shocking. Although they could not find him, the martial god would not miss the day of the sword battle. Thank you, Senior Divine Lord. I will take my leave. Wuk, let's go. Qin Hao said happily as he left the Supreme Tower with Wuk. These 2 little guys are very talented in the way of the sword. Aren't they from the Heaven Wall realm? Why did they call the martial god an elder? The blind sword venerable wondered. The Great Path is boundless. It doesn't matter where the origin is. Didn't the martial god also say that he was from the Great Path Sword Realm? Divine Lord Avicii chuckled. The martial god was indeed strong, but his way of the sword was very ordinary. It was even a bit embarrassing. The martial god was more like a body cultivator. But even so, he still called himself a sword god. What would he do? Senior, I also have something that has been bothering me for a long time. Li Guangxing was about to attack when Divine Lord Avicii waved his hand and interrupted him. I know what you want to ask. I will give you a clear answer. You can leave now. All right, I will leave first. Li Guangxing bowed slightly and walked out with the dust Taoist. Avicii, his situation is a bit similar to yours. Could it be that he also has? Sword Venerable Gu sensed Li Guangxing's aura and guessed. Divine Lord Avicii stopped Sword Venerable Gu from continuing. He waved his hand at the big shots of the God Realm. Everyone understood and left the Supreme Tower. At this time, Sword Venerable Gu glanced at the Venerable Immortal and Loi and said, "You guys talk." Then, he left with the other 5 elders. What followed was a family matter. Loy, this was the first time she saw her father in person. She should have a lot to say. How should I address you? After everyone left, Loy looked at Sword God Avicii. Of course you are, my daughter. Divine Lord Avicii stepped forward and gently stroked Loy's soft cheeks with the back of his hand. Father. Loy's nose twitched, and she threw herself into Divine Lord Avicii's arms. She couldn't hold back her tears, and they fell like pearls. Beside them, Venerable Dongsheng stood there, his smile full of warmth. Chapter 2073. After the Academy Sword Conference ended, the ancient Void Mirage opened to the entire Divine Plane. All the swordsmen from different continents who came for the Sword Conference all flocked into the ancient Void Mirage. Now, the West Capital was bustling with activity. The ancient Void Mirage was an ancient mirage created by the Sword God King's will. It was vast and had its own universe. It hid many ancient treasures and relics of swordsmanship. Naturally, some places were dangerous. Divine Master Wu Jian left sword wills to warn the more dangerous places. Unless the swordsmen who entered the ancient Void Mirage were stupid enough to force their way in, their lives would not be in danger. However, this had nothing to do with Qin Hao and arrest. Now, Wuk and the other 3 were staying in the academy to cultivate. Ancestor Wu Jun left the divine wilderness and wandered the worlds. He settled down in the great Path Sword realm under the name of Martial God. His whereabouts were unpredictable. Unless he showed himself, the 3 divine masters would not be able to find him. Qin Hao did not insist. Since he had come to the great Path Sword realm with Wuk, he would meet the ancestors sooner or later. Moreover, Senior Wu Jian had said that Martial God would appear on the day of the Sword Conference of the 3 realms. Sword God Wu Jian and Immortal Master Dong Sheng created gods to welcome the Sword Conference of the 3 realms. The purpose of the conference was to reappear the pinnacle of the ancient swordsmanship and cultivate a Sword God King to prevent the Great Path Sword realm from being destroyed. The conditions for becoming a divine king were extremely harsh, and the process was fraught with difficulties. Qin Hao couldn't predict whether the 3 divine lords would succeed, but this sword battle had extraordinary significance. No matter who won, Luo Yi, Lu Qiu, or Long Miao would become the target of the 3 divine lords' joint grooming. The entire great way of the sword realm would view the divine sword king as the supreme ruler. It seemed that there was a need to fight. If Wuk won the sword conference of the 3 realms, he would be the master of the sword world and command the billions of swordsmen in the untainted land. Qin Hao controlled the origin realm and carried the power of all living beings in the Kunlun Plain. As long as he was given enough time to strengthen the origin realm of the divine wilderness, when all the gods gathered, he would have taken the first step to becoming a divine king. This was his capital to return to the primeval realm, and he had to return. And at that time, whether or not Wuk became the Sword God King would be equally important to Qin Hao. When 2 God Kings stepped foot into the primeval realm, no matter who they faced, they would have to give them some face. They didn't need to look at anyone's face, and there definitely wouldn't be a second time where they had their souls pulled out and banished to the lower realms. He had to help Wuk win the sword battle of the 3 realms. In the library, Qin Hao came out from the academy. The academy's book collection pavilion had organized a large number of books about swordsmanship and swordsmanship. Every book was full of mysteries. He had benefited a lot from reading them in the past few days. The library of the academy was different from Donghuang's pavilion. The books in Donghuang's pavilion were all about the way of the space, but the academy had combined the divine will of space with the way of the sword, giving birth to extraordinary swordsmanships that contained the power of space. Qin Hao had combined the strengths of both, and his control of the great way of space was getting stronger and stronger. He could clearly feel that he wasn't far from condensing a second divine power. It seems that I have to find teacher. Qin Hao stood at the bottom of the stone steps of the library and exhaled a long breath. Now, the academy had deployed 4 elders with profound skills to give them one-on-one guidance. If they encountered any problems in cultivation, they could find teacher to solve them. As the head of the 6 founding elders, Sword Venerable Gu had chosen Loi. Severing Love was a sword god, and his way of the sword was extraordinary, which coincided with Wux's. Li Guangxing was a disciple of the grass Sword Venerable, and he cultivated a very special sword power of the Great Way. The academy naturally sent Qin Hao a teacher, Blind Sword. Senior Blind Sword was very powerful, and his skills were ranked second among the 6 founding elders, second only to Sword Venerable Gu. Moreover, his understanding of the way of the sword was unparalleled. After several encounters, Qin Hao found that Senior Blind Sword's way of the sword was terrifying, and his use of way was often beyond the imagination of others. Although he was ranked second, Qin Hao judged that Sword Venerable Gu was no match for Blind Sword in a real fight. Unfortunately, Blind Sword was limited by the Sky Wheel. Otherwise, his achievements might not be below Divine Lord of Ichis. Qin Hao felt heartfelt admiration for such a powerful teacher with a transcendent philosophy. Naturally, he liked him very much. It's been more than 100 years since we left the Divine Wilderness. In another few decades, Wu and the rest should have used the power of the original realm to forge the Sky Wheel. Zine and the rest left the Divine Plane and returned to the Heaven's Wall realm. During this time, he also visited Qin Hao and Wuk at the Academy and told them many things to cultivate well. It was good to go back first. The Heaven's Wall realm and the Great Way Sword realm were separated by the vast, untainted land. Although the journey was long, with Zine's cultivation, it would at most take a little longer. Perhaps the next time he came, he would be able to bring Wu and the rest to the Sword Realm, which would save Qin Hao some trouble. He was really afraid that Zhan would cause trouble for Dong Huang in a moment of anger. At present, they could not afford to offend the god of the East. Xiaohan, Craze Tang, Qin Xiaohe, and Chu Yu stayed in the West capital to help Zhang Ji maintain order in the ancient void illusion. Divine Lord Taichu also stayed behind to take care of the juniors outside the academy. Other than the different living quarters, Qin Hao did not find it inconvenient. He and What could go out at any time. They just had to inform the elders, and they could go to the West capital. The academy did not restrict the freedom of the disciples. However, Qin Hao did not know that he and Wuk were exceptions. It was not easy for the other disciples of the academy to go out, probably because of Si Kong. At this moment, a figure stood under the 9 heavens silver waterfall of the academy. He carried an ancient sword on his back and carried the dust of Taoist in his arms as he endured the scouring of the Sword River. It was Li Guangxing. This silver waterfall was not simple. It was derived from the sword will of the elders, and it was called the 9 heavens sword waterfall. The disciples of the academy often came to the sword waterfall to train their swordsmanship. Standing under the waterfall and enduring the scouring of the Sword River could cleanse the swordsman's sword will and temperament. It was said that the senior brothers of the academy said that the 9 waves of the sword waterfall were each stronger than the last. It would set off waves according to the cultivation of the swordsman. The stronger the cultivation, the stronger the sword waves. However, no matter who it was, the difficulty was the same. Now Li Guangxing stood under the sword waterfall to wash his body. The sound of the great path rumbled continuously. He endured the 7 waves and attracted many disciples to watch. Rumble. The sword waterfall erupted with an intense impact. The surging river water surged, and dense sword light flickered within. From afar, it looked like billions of divine swords were attacking from the 9 heavens, ruthlessly smashing toward a person's head. Every drop of water was a sharp sword. One could imagine how terrifying the scene was with the impact of tens of thousands of sword streams. Buzz! The heavenly wheel of the divine path bloomed above Li Guangxing's body. Suddenly, divine light overflowed in all directions. A burst of sword will whistled and rose against the billions of divine swords in an attempt to resist the 8th wave. At this moment, the sword waterfall seemed to have sensed Li Guangxing's increase in strength. Suddenly, billions of sword currents gathered and condensed into a sword. The sword waterfall was like a heavenly heavy sword, majestic and majestic as it fell down. Swoosh! A sharp tearing sound resounded in the air. It was like silk being torn apart. Li Guangxing's rising sword was pushed back by the heavy sword. It was divided into two in the middle. The terrifying sword light fell down from above his head. Go! With a flick of his hand, the ancient sword on his back came out of its scabbard. This was Li Guangxing's life weapon, forged by his sword spirit. This sword was like a beautiful firework that soared into the sky. It clashed with the falling 9 heavens heavy sword. Immediately, a muffled sound exploded in the void. Turbulent waves rolled toward the two sides of the cliff. The straight river of swords became distorted. However, that heavy aura still suppressed Li Guangxing's life weapon. The ancient sword flew out in a spin. Close by, the river of swords heavily smashed onto Li Guangxing's body. The second his body came in contact with the water, he was blown away. Zong! 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 Li Guangxing's legs were shaking. He landed on the shore and took a few steps back. Only when a powerful palm pressed down on his shoulder did he manage to stabilize his body. You're amazing, brother. Qin Hao smiled. Li Guangxing turned around and saw Qin Hao. He sighed helplessly. Unfortunately, you still can't withstand the 8th wave of swords. This 8th wave of swords contained the powerful will of Wei of at least 5 elders. When the 5 sword wills merged, no matter what the sword's characteristics were, it was impossible to resist. Indeed, the sword wills merged into the 8th wave. Other than the 4 elders, there is also the power of the wind, sword of the supreme swordsman of the wind sword. Where the sword wills point, the power is like a prairie fire. Junior brother Li has just entered the academy, but he can withstand the 7th wave. It's really impressive. A disciple of the academy who was watching from the outside praised. Many people agreed. Li Guangxing's sword wills were much stronger than when they entered the academy. Let me try. Qin Hao strode forward and jumped down to the bottom of the sword waterfall. He stood on a 10,000-year-old bluestone. Junior brother, it's up to you. Li Guangxing raised his hand to call back the famous ancient sword. He put it back into the scabbard and looked at Qin Hao with interest. He remembered that on the day of the sword competition, Qin Hao had not made a move. In the end, he was forced into a dead end by Loi. In the end, he exploded and shocked the entire divine region. He was evenly matched with Loi. To be fair, Li Guangxing did not have the confidence to win against Loi. Naturally, his chances of winning against Qin Hao were very small. The 4 new junior brothers are all very strong. Isn't that so? Junior sister Luo is the daughter of the Divine Master and the Immortal Lord. I heard that on the day of the sword competition, Danqing was looked down upon by junior sister Loi. In the end, she chose junior brother Chu San for the sword competition. Ha ha ha. Yes. It's too funny. How embarrassing. Hey, junior brother Chu San. Danqing's record in the sword waterfall is also the 7 waves. You must break his record. On both sides of the sword waterfall, many disciples of the academy shouted and encouraged Qin Hao, who was on the bluestone. They did not care about one of the disciples who was so angry that his face turned blue. Junior brother Chu San, if you can withstand the 8 waves, I will give you the liquor I kept before the ascension stage. Danqing put his palms beside his mouth and shouted loudly. His face was full of smiles. How long had it been since he ascended to the ascension stage? It had been thousands of years. It was a good liquor that had been kept in the mortal world until now. But he did not know if Qin Hao had the ability to drink it. Chapter 2074. Boom, boom, boom. In the 9 heavens sword waterfall, the sound of the great path sword resounded throughout the sky. Waves after waves of violent waves crashed into Qin Hao's body. The surface of his body was enveloped in a layer of hazy halo, and not a drop of water could touch it. Gradually, as the waves overpowered the previous one, the halo became stronger and stronger, until a majestic divine light shot up from the bluestone into the sky, forcefully cutting the rapid waterfall apart. Which wave is this? The 8th wave. Looking at the situation, he didn't use much strength at all. Monster! On both sides of the sword waterfall, the outstanding disciples of the academy were dumbfounded. In 10 minutes, Qin Hao broke through 8 waves consecutively. He didn't bear it, but directly used sword will to break through the sword momentum of the silver waterfall. His posture was extremely domineering. Next, it was the 9th wave. At this moment, Qin Hao had his hands behind his back as he stood towering on the 10,000-year-old limestone, and he raised his eyes to look above. After the 8-layer waves passed, the sword waterfall calmed down, and the river water seemed as if it was still, and the slightly flickering waves of scales seemed to contain an extraordinary might. The first wave is the power of the sword. It's very pure, without any sword will, only sharpness. The second wave contains artistic conception. Without a firm sword heart, it's easy to be shaken out by the water of the waterfall. The third wave contains the power of the sword, artistic conception, and the attribute of the sword way. It's like 10,000 mountains descending. Every wave felt different. In addition to the 10,000 mountains descending, the fourth wave had another attribute. It was soft like grass, but tough. The fifth wave contained 3 attributes, and so on. In the 9 waves of the sword waterfall, each wave was stronger than the last. Just now, Qin Hao broke through the 8th wave, breaking the sword momentum of the storm that suppressed Li Guangxing. Now, only the last wave was left. Boom! The quiet river of swords regained its vigor. The tranquil surface of the water was like a heavenly river that had opened its floodgates. Within the surging white waves, there were actually figures dancing with swords. Every figure's silhouette was like 6 doyens riding the river and dancing with their swords. The sword light that was swept up was extremely fierce. Their sword will is merging. The sword momentum of the 9th wave is no longer just 6 doyens. The sword wills of the 6 elders fused into the final layer, but they were not 6 independent entities. Instead, the 6 sword wills intertwined to form a brand new power. In an instant, the look in Qin Hao's eyes changed. His eyes, which were flashing with flaming patterns, shot toward the shadows, as if he could see through the essence of their swordsmanship. Then, Qin Hao raised one of his hands behind his back and pointed upward. Whoosh! The fine sword's splendor blended into the river. Its speed was incomparably fast, as if it had turned into an afterimage, appearing in front of the 6 elders. The afterimage streaked past, and before the 9 layers of momentum had finished brewing, the elders' figures were destroyed one after another. Boom! The surging sword waterfall lost its shape, as if a person's soul had been shattered, falling into a hysterical riot. The sword river flowed in reverse. The waves rose, and the waterfall actually flowed back to the source. The scene was magnificent. It can't be. Oh my God! All the disciples were shocked. Apart from the first 2, the 3rd disciple of the academy had withstood the sword waterfall 9 waves today. However, Qin Hao was different from the first 2. He did not bear the impact of the sword waterfall, but completely broke through the 9 layers of sword waves. There was an essential difference between the 2. What monster? Junior brother, how did you do it? Someone asked Qin Hao. Yes, junior brother Chu San, I also want to know. Li Guangxing looked up at the sword waterfall. The 9 waves had been broken, and the waterfall flowed in reverse. The sword will emanating from Qin Hao's body had already forced the 9 heaven sword waterfall to stay away from him. Among all the skills in the world, only speed is unbreakable. Qin Hao responded with a smile, leaped into the sky, and disappeared. Since his sword could break through the sword momentum, why not go through the baptism? Boom! The reverse waterfall exploded with a roar. As Qin Hao's aura disappeared, the river flowed down and returned to its original state. The sword waterfall has become a spirit. Everyone was speechless. They deeply understood what it meant to bully the weak and fear the strong. Qin Hao had just left, and it was arrogant again. All the disciples knew that speed was unbreakable, but who could really do it? The difficulty was not as simple as 1 or 2 sentences. Junior brother, Chu San has left. He just secretly transmitted a message to you to leave the wine for me. Junior brother Dan Xing, I won't be polite. Quickly take it out and let me taste it. A middle-aged disciple stretched out his hand to Danqing with a solemn expression. Junior brother Chu Sen also transmitted a message to me and let me taste it together. Me too. Me too. One by one, they stretched out their hands in front of Danqing. Looking at their righteous appearances, Danqing felt 1,000 swords whistling in his heart. He really wanted to stab this group of people to death on the spot. Secretly transmitted a message? Why do they have to do it secretly? Who are they trying to fool? However, he could not beat them. Danqing had to take out the wine and share it with everyone. Listen over there. The sword chime of the swordsmanship seeking pagoda. Junior brother Chu San has gone to cause trouble. Let's go and have a look. In the distance, the swordsmanship seeking pagoda burst into thousands of divine lights. A gorgeous divine sword shadow broke out of the window and circled around the sword pagoda, flying in the void. Li Guangxing's expression changed slightly, and he flew over there. Not long ago, he and Loi stimulated the 9th floor of the sword pagoda and summoned 80 swords. Only the last sword had not appeared. Now, Li Chuji had gone to the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. Could he completely understand the 81 swords of the Divine Master? Chapter 2075. The Swordsmanship-Seeking Pagoda. Loi sat under the pagoda with a focused expression. Sword will permeated her body as she tried to resonate with the sword spirits in the pagoda and comprehend the Divine Master Sword will contain within. She had been cultivating here for a long time. Since the day she entered the academy, the last sword had become a knot in her heart. She had longed to summon it and complete the 81 swords. However, she had never been able to do so. At this moment, Luo Yi looked at the silver-haired youth standing not far away from her. Qin Hao was surrounded by divine light, and his sword aura soared into the sky. His sword will whizzed out and climbed up along the ancient pagoda. Every time the sword will cover the floor, 9 beams of divine light would penetrate through the window and fly high into the sky. So far, the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda had been influenced by Qin Hao's sword will. 8 floors had been lit, and 72 swords had been unleashed. There was no gap in the entire process. It's the 9th floor, Loi murmured. Her heart was not calm. When she first came here to ask for swords, the speed of awakening the sword spirits was not as fast as Qin Hao. This guy would have no problem rushing to the 9th floor. She just did not know if he could summon the last sword. Qin Hao raised his head and stared at the towering ancient pagoda. Standing at the foot of the pagoda, he couldn't help but feel tiny in his heart. This was a kind of momentum. It was the innate momentum of the Divine Master. There were 81 swords in the pagoda. Each sword spirit was engraved with the will of the Divine Master of Avicii. There were 81 sword wills in total. The entire ancient pagoda was no doubt equivalent to an avatar of the Divine Master. One could imagine the pressure it released. Go! Qin Hao bellowed, and the billowing sword intent rushed up. He did not feel small under the pagoda. On the contrary, through the momentum of the Divine Master, he vaguely raised his own limits. Even if his cultivation was not there, his state of mind was there. At this moment, he gave off the feeling that he was standing there as the Divine Master. Boom! The sword will of the Great Path rushed forward. The swordsmanship-seeking pagoda trembled. The sound of swords crisscrossed in the void. At this moment, the light that covered the 8th floor continued to spread upwards, climbing up to the 9th floor. Sword windows lit up one after another, and sharp light broke through the windows. The shape of each light was different, and there were a total of 80 divine swords of different shapes flying outside the tower. It was a spectacular sight. Junior Chu San is strong. Impressive. There's only one sword left. I wonder if Junior Brother can break it. Many disciples of the academy had gathered around the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. Li Guangxing and the others had also rushed over from the sword waterfall. At this moment, everyone witnessed Qin Hao comprehending 80 swords and drawing out 80 sword spirits from the pagoda. They danced freely with his sword intent, which was really amazing. resonance, comprehension, and whether or not one could fully control it. There were 3 levels. Qin Hao drew out the sword spirit and used his own sword intent to drive the divine sword, achieving the last type. His performance could be said to be perfect. In fact, it was better than Loi and Li Guangxing. However, summoning the last sword spirit was not easy. So far, not a single disciple in the Seamless Academy had been able to do it. Only a few elders, such as Tianyang Kenshin, and the 6 founding elders have been able to do it. Therefore, the disciples also wanted to witness a miracle, which was enough to set a record in the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. The last sword in the pagoda is not a sword. In other words, there are number 81 swords on the 9th floor. The so-called last sword is nothing more than oneself. Qin Hao's Wei will whistled all over his body. Threads of light of catastrophe flickered, covering the weak aura of the perfect celestial wheel below his body. His eyes would not deceive him. Even if what the 10,000 spirit fire eyes saw was not real, his perception would not be wrong. The power of the original realm seeped into the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. No matter what kind of sword intent the last sword contained, it would definitely not transcend the complete heavenly path. However, after searching all 9 floors, there was no trace of the last sword. There were number 81 swords in the pagoda. Qin Hao suddenly understood. No wonder Li Guangxing could not be summoned. Loi tried her best to mobilize the power of the Great Path, but could not resonate with the last sword. If he guessed correctly, the last sword needed the warrior to fill in the gaps and integrate the sword intent to give birth to the last sword. It was almost impossible for an ordinary divine path to evolve a divine master-level sword intent. Even if there was a genius who saw through this step and cast a sword spirit, it would definitely not resonate with the other 80 swords. It was basically a doomed situation. Fortunately, my Great Path aura is complete. It is a complete celestial wheel. Qin Hao smiled. Others cannot do it. If someone as strong as Loi could not understand it, she would not be able to draw out the last sword either. However, Qin Hao could do it. No matter what kind of sword intent he integrated into the pagoda, it would not be rejected by the other 80 sword spirits. This was because his path was a complete sword path. Come out! Qin Hao roared heroically. He raised his arm and pulled at the last dim window on the 9th floor of the ancient pagoda. Whoosh! There was an ear-piercing sound of friction in the air, as if 2 pieces of hard metal were rubbing against each other. Then everyone covered their chests in shock. The pitch-black, empty window on the 9th floor gradually lit up and became brighter and brighter. A fiery red sword shape slowly extended out. With a clang, it broke free from the shackles of the ancient pagoda. It jumped out of the majestic divine master momentum and became a divine sword surrounded by bloody flames. It flew toward the sword spirits in the sky and was finally placed in the center, surrounded by the 80 sword spirits. I can't believe my eyes. The last sword contains the great Tao of fire. How is this possible? The 81st sword of the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda has appeared. The 81st sword has appeared. Some disciples seemed to have gone mad. They shouted loudly and ran toward the sword peaks of the academy. Almost at the same time, powerful auras descended on the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. Every figure that descended was an elder of the academy. There was no lack of sword gods who had been in seclusion for many years. When they arrived and saw the 81 sword spirits flying in front of the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda, they were all stunned. The 81st sword has appeared. Li Guangxing's heart trembled violently. He squeezed the dust of Tao in his hand tightly. His body trembled with excitement. Loi stood up from her meditation. However, the moment she stood up, she was stunned. It was as if her soul had fallen into the 81 sword spirits. Interesting. At this time, in the Supreme Tower, Divine Lord Avici, who was playing chess with Sword Venerable Gu, suddenly stopped above the chessboard. He looked through the Divine Tower and sensed the situation in the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. This kid is not simple. Although he used the wrong method, the result did not change, Sword Venerable Gu said. Gu Jianzun said, His calm expression flashed with a hint of palpitation, as if he had guessed something. It is not surprising that he has a perfect heaven wheel. After all, he is the descendant of the martial god. Divine Lord Avicii placed his chess piece. The black pieces surrounded the white pieces. There was a flash of brilliance, and the chessboard disappeared. "Brother, you have lost," Divine Lord Avicii said with a smile. Sword Venerable Gu nodded. "It is normal to lose to you. Why don't you tell them that the martial god is in the academy? Karma has its own destiny. When it is time to show up, I will show up. There is no need to mess up the game of others." Divine Lord Avicii said, "A true gentleman does not speak when watching a chess game." He knew that the martial god must have sensed Qin Hao. As for how to contact him and what to do, the martial god would arrange it. "You are right." Sword Venerable Gu stood up slowly with his hands behind his back. His worried heart suddenly calmed down. Two perfect heaven wheels. It seems that the future of the great path sword realm is not too bad. When the time comes, there will be a way to break the tribulation. My ability is limited. It depends on the martial god. Empyrean Divine Lord's heart was still heavy. The three of them had an agreement with the martial god that they would share the burden. However, the martial god's cultivation was still too shallow. When the raging waves engulfed the sword world, would he be able to withstand them? The swordsmanship seeking pagoda. The space was silent. After dozens of breaths, there was a sudden burst of loud cheers. The disciples of the academy laughed wildly and surrounded Qin Hao. They were all excited and wanted to line up and hug him. Junior brother has broken the shackles of the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda. He is really strong. We are so envious and jealous. But I'm very curious. Why did the last sword in the pagoda contain the great path of flame? Divine Lord cultivates the sword will of space. Why do you care so much? Junior brother, tell us quickly. Is there a trick to awakening the last sword? The disciples asked one after another. Ahem, the sword way depends on one's understanding and experimentation. Everyone's way is different. My understanding may not be suitable for all of you. Qin Hao said. Could he say that the last sword was his sword will? As for the trick to awaken it, his words were very clear. It depended on one's attempt. Junior brother, although it is simple, your understanding of the sword way is really profound. One of the senior brothers fell into deep contemplation. Junior brother Chu San, here is the aged wine of the mortal world. Just now, the senior brothers snatched it quickly. I risked my life and only managed to keep the last mouthful. Dan Qing smiled and passed the wine jar to Qin Hao. Qin Hao held it in his hand and poured it down his throat. The wine brewed from grains was naturally not as good as the immortal nectar, but it had a different taste of the mortal world. It could not help but make one think of thousands of things. Good wine. A hot feeling slid down his throat. Qin Hao returned the wine jar to Dan Qing and exuded a heroic aura. He leaped up and turned into a ray of light, heading in another direction. Sword Pavilion. Dan Qing looked over. Qin Hao's target was the Sword Pavilion of the Academy. Junior brother Chu, sand is going to cause trouble again. The Sword Pavilion has 9 echoes. I wonder how many he can withstand. Let's go and have a look. The disciples from the Sword Waterfall joined the team of the Sword Pagoda, forming a mighty lineup and heading to the Sword Pavilion at the same time. Junior sister Loi, don't you want to go and have a look? Li Guangxing asked. Loi shook her head as if she had just recovered from the 81 sword spirits. She looked at the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda, which had calmed down again. The sharpness in her eyes became more and more intense. I want to ask for the 81st sword. Li Guangxing took a deep breath and nodded silently. Loi was very stubborn and would not give up until she reached her goal. This was also a good thing. Then he turned into a ray of light and flew to the Sword Pavilion. He wanted to see what Qin Hao would do. Could it be that this guy wanted to break into all the sword training halls of the Academy? The Sword Pavilion was an ancient and magnificent sword tower. Countless kinds of sword wills were sealed inside by the Divine Master. When the sword wills resonated, they would cause the sword sound of the Great Law, which would deeply stimulate the mind of swordsmen and temper his sword heart and sword way. Ordinary people could not bear it. It was said that the sword pavilion had 9 echoes, which was the strongest. Few disciples could withstand it completely. If it was light, their sword soul would be damaged. If it was serious, they might be stimulated by the sword sound and go crazy. At this moment, the ancient sword pavilion emitted a dazzling radiance. The gorgeous radiance clasped tightly onto the ground. From the outside, it looked like a glowing bell pressing down on the ground. The vigorous clashing sound from the bell could shatter a person's liver and gallbladder. "How many echoes has it been?" Qin Hao asked the disciple outside the sword pavilion. "The 7th echo. Junior brother Wuck's sword heart is really strong. When I first came to the academy, I couldn't even withstand 3 echoes. By the way, are you together?" the disciple asked. Qin Hao nodded. "Yes, we are together. Junior brother, you have to work hard. Junior brother Wuck's talent is really terrifying," the disciple encouraged. He was worried for Qin Hao. The disciples in the same batch were often compared by the elders. It was very embarrassing to be inferior. If one's state of mind was unstable, it would be easy to be affected. "I will work hard." Qin Hao smiled and stared at the sword pavilion. The 7th echo. Wuck had reached this level without forging the celestial wheel. He was stronger than the old disciples of the previous batches. It was obvious that his talent was monstrous. However, Qin Hao was not bad either. At least his current endurance was definitely stronger than Wuck's. Chapter 2076. Wooling Chinese Network Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation swept out Wuck was meditating in the sword pavilion. The empty sword pavilion was filled with sword wheels. Thousands of sword wheels intertwined. Some were as powerful as mountains, some were as sharp as blades, some were as soft as water, and some were as cold as ice. Every sword wheel was different and extremely terrifying. They shuttled back and forth in the sword pavilion, constantly attacking Wuck's body. The sonorous sounds of swords colliding with the walls were transmitted to Wuck's spiritual soul. Wuck felt as if thousands of swords were piercing his soul and cutting his flesh. Dong! The 7th sound came from the sword pavilion. Lights and shadows intertwined, and the chaotic sound of swords pierced through his eardrums. Wuck's head buzzed, and his chi and blood surged. He looked somewhat painful. The golden particles on his body whistled, and the sword lotus of the great path bloomed under him. The sword wheel of all things flickered on the surface of his body, tenaciously guarding his mind and resisting the violent impact. But after a few breaths, as blood slowly seeped from the corner of his mouth, his expression became more and more distorted. Countless disordered shadows seemed to appear in his body. The sword lotus suddenly collapsed, and hot blood spurted out from his throat, turning into a beam of sword light and escaping in a panic. So scary. Wuck's breath was very chaotic, and his hair became messy. He looked back at the sword pavilion, full of fear. 7 sound from the sword pavilion. Junior brother, you are awesome. Although you didn't make it, not many people can make it to the 7th sound. Junior brother, you have a bright future. The disciples outside were full of praise. Wuck could make it to the 7th sound as a Nirvana emperor. After all the disciples who had entered the sword pavilion to cultivate had cast the heavenly wheel of the great path. Even so, not many people could make it to the 7th sound. Senior brothers, you are flattering me. Wuck smiled. He was naturally happy to be praised. Next to him, Qin Hao clicked his tongue and said, "Only 7 sounds. Kid, you can't make it." Wuck turned around and saw Qin Hao. He snorted and said, "Why don't you go in and try? 7 echoes of the sword pavilion is already amazing. This junior brother probably hasn't entered it before, so he doesn't know how powerful it is." The other disciples disagreed with Qin Hao's point of view. "All right, I'll go in and have a look." Qin Hao calmly walked towards the sword pavilion. His bearing is not ordinary, but his tone is a bit irritating. A disciple joked with Wuck, "You two entered the academy together, right?" The Academy Sword Conference had caused a sensation in the Divine region. However, the Academy did not pay too much attention to this matter. Most of them were busy cultivating and improving their swordsmanship. Together, this guy is usually very arrogant, Wux said. The other smiled. From his behavior, it could be seen that Qin Hao was extremely arrogant. However, which of the people here wasn't arrogant in the past? This kind of arrogance would gradually be worn away with time. Dong! The sound of a strong impact drew everyone's attention back. Qin Hao had already started in the sword pavilion. Then, a group of people arrived and landed on the ground. An old disciple pointed at Jianga and asked, "Did he go in?" "Who?" the previous disciple asked curiously. "Junior brother in the 3rd year. Silver hair," the old disciple said solemnly. "Oh, the silver-haired one went in. It has already started." The disciple of Jianga turned around and smiled. Come. Line up and watch the show. Let's bet. How many rings?" "Nonsense. 9 rings. Do you dare to bet?" Thump. The disciple who stayed in the sword pavilion was shocked. He looked at the group of gamblers and said in surprise, "Are you serious? 9 rings? Senior brother Wei Zhe, do you want to bet with us? The odds are 1 to 5. Junior brother in the 3rd year will definitely get 9 rings." The disciple who started the bet had a cunning look in his eyes. "This is a gift for me." The disciple named Wei Zhe strode forward, rolled up his sleeves, and squatted on the ground. Many disciples of the sword pavilion also rushed over. What kind of joke was this? Could someone withstand 9 rings? They did not believe it. "Senior brother Wei Zhe, how much should we bet?" Someone asked. "Bet as much as you can. I'll bet everything I have. 1 to 5. It's such a big bargain. I'll bet my divine sword as well." Wei Zhe was a man of his word. With a flash of light in his hand, he took out his precious divine sword and threw it into the bet. Seeing this, the other disciples took out the divine gems in their storage rings. Some people, like Wei Zhe, also bet their divine weapons. This time, the disciples from the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda and the sword waterfall laughed. "Junior brother Wei, since you were so generous, I won't stand on ceremony." The old disciple took off all the storage rings in his hand and threw them all on the 9 echoes. After that, he carefully turned over and tried to find other useful items on his body. He hated that he could not sit in the gambling house himself. What happened to brother Wei Jian? Wei Zhe was puzzled. Usually, Wei Jian was very stingy. Why did he suddenly become a different person? The 81 sword spirits from the swordsmanship-seeking pagoda broke the 9 waves of the sword waterfall and reversed the sword essence of the waterfall. I wonder if the 9 rings of the sword pavilion can stop Chu San. Outside the crowd, Li Guangxing sighed faintly. Wei Zhe's heart suddenly trembled. Blood seemed to rush from his chest to his throat. He suddenly lost his mind. He lowered his head and looked at the bet. "Can I back out?" Dong! 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 Sounds of impact kept coming out from the sword pavilion. Every sound seemed to hit the minds of everyone, trying to shatter their souls. At this moment, the outside of the sword pavilion was densely packed with disciples. At a glance, there were no less than 100 disciples. Except for those who were in seclusion, most of the disciples had gathered qi. There were also many elders and deacons. These people were all looking at the dazzling sword pavilion in front of them. They were silently counting in their hearts. When they counted to 8, their expressions changed greatly. Many of the elders' faces twisted. Dong! There was another sound, and an incomparably violent impact spread out. Inside the dazzling sword pavilion, a sound wave mixed with terrifying sword qi swept out. The sound wave caused the seated disciples and elders to release their heavenly wheels one after another, forming a spectacular human wall that was forced to resist. In the process, many disciples who were hit by the sound waves turned pale. 9 rings of the sword pavilion. A new disciple who had just entered had broken the record of the previous disciples. How could they not be shocked? The mighty shadow of the sword radiated into the sky and gushed out from the top of the sword garret. With every sound, the radiating sword radiance grew stronger and stronger. Finally, the light pierced through the sky of the academy. All the cultivators in the divine domain saw the most spectacular scene in their lives from afar. "How many rings has it been?" an elder asked. 16, the deacon next to him replied. He was shocked beyond words. "And he doesn't seem to want to stop," another elder said. At present, Qin Hao not only withstood the unbroken 9 rings of the sword pavilion, but also continued to raise the sword sounds. It seemed that he had entered the way and merged with the sword pavilion to refine the universe of Swordway inside. This ability? Was he really just a disciple? And he had just entered the academy not long ago. The elders were all silent. Even the founding members might not be able to do it, but it happened to a disciple. 17, 18. The sound of impact in the sword pavilion has stopped. As the powerful sword essence in the outside world gradually dissipated, the sound of agitating the divine soul gradually calmed down. When the mighty radiance of the sword pavilion dissipated, many disciples sat on the ground weakly, as if their strength had been sucked out of them. 18 rings. Only a monster could do that. If it weren't for the fact that the sword principle universe in the sword pavilion was no longer effective on Qin Hao, he would probably be able to make another 18 echoes. After all, the people outside could sense that Qin Hao's aura didn't weaken at all. Instead, it became stronger. Dong! Just when everyone thought that it was over, a sound wave suddenly swept out from the sword pavilion. The impact of the sword essence, which was caught off guard, almost caused the elders present to fall to the ground. Then, Qin Hao's figure appeared in everyone's sight. He slowly walked out of the gate of the sword pavilion. However, the space outside was completely silent. "Oh, there's so many people." Qin Hao was also shocked. He looked at the figures standing on the ground, in the air, and on the branches. There were many dignified elders and deacons. He had only tried 9 rings in the sword pavilion to experience life, but it seemed that he had alarmed the entire academy. "Junior brother, you're ruthless." Li Guangxing gave Qin Hao a thumbs up. He rarely admired others in his life, but today he had to. "It's SOSO. Qin Hao smiled modestly. He walked to Wuck's side and put his hand on his shoulder. "Alas, young man, you have to work hard." It was effortless for him to make 18 rings, but Wuck only made it to 7 rings. Wasn't this embarrassing for the divine wilderness? Wuck's face trembled. "Keep pretending." Qin Hao possessed the power of the original realm, and it cast a perfect sky wheel. Many of the powerful restrictions of the Academy's ashram actually had no effect on him. If it were him who had cast the sky wheel, his performance would not necessarily be worse than Qin Hao's. This guy was obviously bullying him because his cultivation was low. He can. I met Senior Brother once in the He Mansion. I'm willing to be Senior Brother's sword attendant and serve Senior Brother. I'll never betray you." At this time, a figure suddenly ran out of the crowd and unexpectedly knelt in front of Qin Hao. He swore to become Qin Hao's sword attendant. "He can. One of Crane Lord's men?" Qin Hao looked down and had a vague impression of him. "His son is my father. I hope Senior Brother can fulfill my wish." He can kowtowed and begged. What did it mean to have 19 rings in the sword pavilion? Deacon was also a swordsman. He had been in the academy for a long time and knew the importance and difficulty of each dojo. Qin Hao's performance was unprecedented and probably would not be repeated in the future. Compared to Deacon Shui, Qin Hao's talent was simply immeasurable. To be able to be the sword attendant of such a peerless swordsman was definitely better than following Deacon Shui. "I see." Qin Hao remembered. He did look like his son. He shook his head and said, "Unfortunately, you're not qualified." After that, Qin Hao stepped into the air and disappeared from the sword pavilion. He might hold a grudge, but he would never deliberately belittle others. With He Can's talent, even being a sword attendant was not enough to travel with him. If it were Mu Zhan from Rikudenji, it would be possible. But He Can was not. "You're indeed not qualified to be his sword attendant." Li Guangxing lowered his head and said to He Can. Then he flicked his Taoist dust and disappeared into the distance. Gradually, the crowd dispersed and figures left one after another. In the end, only He Can was left kneeling on the ground alone with a sorrowful face. He was the son of Crane Lord and also came from a divine path family. Was he not even qualified to be a sword attendant? He can. I think you're not tough enough. It's hard to learn anything in the academy. Why don't you go back to your father? In the distance, an elder in the deacon's robe of the academy said, Deacon Shui, I go. The academy is not suitable for a swordsman like you. Deacon Shui turned and left indifferently. Chapter 2077. The blind sword venerable sat on the Sioux sword peak. The peak reached into the clouds, overlooking everything. His was spread out, and the infinite divine domain could be seen at a glance. Not long after, a sword light pierced through the clouds and turned into a figure that landed beside the blind sword. Qin Hao looked at the cloth covering his eyes and asked, Teacher, can you see? My sword can see. The blind sword venerable replied calmly. Blind sword answered calmly. Qin Hao smiled and sat down beside blind sword. Through the rolling sea of clouds, he looked down at the vast Avicii divine domain. Why don't you regain your sight? The celestial wheel cultivators lived as long as the heavens. Their Tao was indestructible, and their divine spirit was indestructible. The blind sword's Tao was profound, and he was the elder brother of the realm lord. If he wanted to, he could reopen his eyes, because the naked eye is not suitable for my Tao. The blind sword faced Qin Hao and felt the surging will flowing in his body. The aura he slowly emitted seemed to melt into the Sioux sword peak and become one with it. He nodded and said, Your celestial wheel has gradually adapted and begun to control the divine will of space. You are about to condense the second divine power, right? The blind sword could clearly sense everything that had happened in the sword waterfall, the sword inquiry pagoda, and the sword pavilion. In particular, Qin Hao had caused 19 echoes in the sword pavilion. He had used the powerful divine will of space to forcibly separate the sword will of the sword pavilion. To be able to do this proved that he had complete control of the power of space. I can't hide anything from you, teacher. Qin Hao smiled and admitted, but I don't understand how the essence of the celestial wheel divine will is different. Or rather, which kind of power in the world deserves to be called the strongest from the root? If other people ask this question, I can give them a clear answer. You are different. Every divine will in the world is the strongest to you. The blind sword stared at Qin Hao's face. It was as if two sharp lights shot out from the black cloth covering his eyes and pierced into Qin Hao's spiritual soul, prying into his situation clearly. Qin Hao felt an inexplicable chill in his heart. He felt that in front of his teacher, there were no secrets to speak of. In an instant, Qin Hao thought that perhaps his teacher had already noticed that his heavenly wheel was different from others. It was a complete heavenly wheel of the Great Path. Since Blind Sword could see through it, Divine Lord Avicii, Sword Venerable Gu, and the other elders could naturally see through his concealment. But the Academy was the Academy, and they wouldn't ask too much. When divine power fuses into your celestial wheel, no matter what kind of power it will be able to unleash its full potential. However, if we have to talk about the strongest, I think the one that you're most used to and most familiar with is the one that suits you the most. Blind Sword gave his opinion. He understood the confusion in Qin Hao's heart. The complete heavenly wheel contained the power of all things and formed its own universe. If too much divine power was fused into it, it would inevitably cause people to wonder which kind of divine power was best used. In fact, Qin Hao could do the best in every one of them. He was not like Li Guangxing and Loi. Tianluan was the most sensitive to sword intent. If he threw away sword intent, other divine powers would not be able to blend in. Disciple understands. Qin Hao stood up and bowed solemnly to Blind Sword. Then he bowed slightly to the Academy. Go. Your talent is destined to be extraordinary in the future. The Seamless Sword realm is just a scenery that you pass by. In the future, don't doubt yourself. Your Tao is the complete Tao, the strongest Tao. Blind Sword revealed a comforting smile. People like Qin Hao could not be limited to one world. His future would be bright in the whole untainted land. and he would be worshipped and trembled by the people. The blind sword felt lucky to be able to guide him on his life path. After all, when Qin Hao stepped onto the peak of the wilderness, looking back at this blind man and the entire seamless academy, they were insignificant. Qin Hao left Su's sword peak. Blind Sword's words had opened his heart and strengthened his resolve. In the following days, everything was peaceful in the academy. Everyone was busy with cultivation. Qin Hao wanted to take Wuk to the ancient void dreamland in the west capital, but severing love told them there was no need. The ancient void dreamland was derived from the divine will of the Sword God King. Everything inside had been integrated into divine Lord Avicii's body long ago, and then he established the academy. The Sword Dao collection and dojo in the academy were actually copies of the essence of the ancient void dreamland. Since Qin Hao and the rest had become disciples of the academy, they could read the books at any time and use the dojo to train. There was no need for them to go to the ancient void dreamland. The opening of the ancient void dreamland was to make up for the talents who did not become disciples of the academy at the sword discourse field. Only there would be real gains. Qin Hao and the rest would be meaningless. In the blink of an eye, several years had passed. Qin Hao and Wuk had been cultivating in the academy. They had made great progress. Wuk had improved in the Sword Dao, while Qin Hao had improved as a whole. On this day, a strange phenomenon suddenly appeared on the Su Sword Peak. The wind and clouds were strange, and divine light shot into the sky. A figure stood high in the sky, greedily absorbing the essence of the realm. This kid is making rapid progress. Yes, he has only been in the academy for 4 years, and he is already condensing the second divine power of the heavenly wheel. According to Blind Sword, this kid has only been a god for 300 years. His potential is terrifying. Vigorous figures stood side by side on the Sword Peak. Sword Lord Gu and the other 6 doyens looked at the sky at the same time, watching the power of the Great Path enter Qin Hao's body bit by bit. The light became brighter and brighter. It was not only the sword will, but also the divine will of the space of the entire realm. It kept surging, nourishing his divine body and merging into his spiritual soul. It's going to happen. Dan Xing secretly clenched his fists. The disciples in every corner of the academy looked in the direction of the Su Sword Peak. At this time, with a loud roar that shook the world, an extremely strong pressure of space suddenly swept out from the sky, crazily covering the academy. Everyone vaguely felt that the heavenly path was sinking and the entire realm seemed to be collapsing. It was going to bury them and seal them in a dead silence. Boom! The divine splendor that whizzed out of Qin Hao's body disappeared. The strange wind and clouds were broken by a ray of light, revealing the clear sky. He clenched his fist lightly, and thick white particles overflowed from his palm. These white particles filled every part of his body, in his flesh, meridians, blood, and even his will and spiritual soul. They turned into a large net that connected to his limbs and bones. At this moment, he felt that the entire space of the infinite divine domain existed within his divine consciousness. After the Red Lotus divine power, today he had condensed the second divine power, space. Congratulations. Congratulations, Junior Brother. Junior 3. Before I met you, I always thought that I was a genius. After meeting you, why do I feel like an ordinary person? Li Guangxing's face was full of helplessness. Congratulations, Li Chuji. Loi stepped forward and looked at Qin Hao, who was covered in white particles. A ray of fighting spirit appeared in her eyes, but it quickly dimmed. In the past, she could not do anything to Qin Hao. Now that Qin Hao controlled the divine power of space and basically ignored the power of the realm, what could she do to him? Win? That was not very realistic. Now Loi was considering whether she could withstand a few moves from Qin Hao. She sadly found that Li Guangxing was not the only one who had been reduced to an ordinary person. Even she, who stood in front of Qin Hao, was reduced to an ordinary person. Qin Hao smiled at the crowd, and his gaze shifted to Loi. Why? Do you still want to try with me? Forget it. I may not be able to defeat you. Loi said. Haha. Dan Qing and the other disciples of the academy laughed. Loi was fierce. Usually, they were bullied by Loi. Now, facing Qin Hao, the princess of the Divine Master was at her wits' end. Why don't I see Wuk? Qin Hao looked around. Wuk was not present. Qin Hao had to find a chance to teach him a lesson so that he would not be too proud of his swordsmanship. Don't blame him. He is in seclusion. I won't let him out. Sword Elder Severing Love's laughter came from the Su Jianfeng. Qin Hao stepped out of the void and bowed slightly to the 6 elders. He asked Severing Love, "Is he going to forge the heavenly wheel?" Severing Love smiled and nodded. "Haha, after so long, that kid has finally forged the heavenly wheel." Qin Hao was overjoyed. He asked the elders, "When the time comes, I hope that the elders will lend a hand." The difference between forging the heavenly wheel on his own and the sword god's power of the great Tao was huge. Back then, Qin Hao had no choice. He was the first god in the divine wilderness. Now that the elders were willing to help, Wuk's heavenly wheel would be even stronger. If the Divine Master was willing to channel the power of the great world into Wuk's sword will, it would naturally be better. I will act according to the circumstances. Severing Love gave Qin Hao a reassuring look. After all, Wuk cultivated under him and was his disciple in name. Thank you, elders. Qin Hao was relieved. This way, Wuk had a higher chance of forging a complete heavenly wheel like him. 3rd year of the Lunar New Year. You have cultivated in the academy for a while. It's time to go out and take a look. Coincidentally, the Divine Master has a mission for you. Sword Sovereign Goose said. Mission? Qin Hao's expression turned serious. Yes, go to the Supreme Tower. Wu Jian is waiting for you. Sword Sovereign Gu pointed at Loi and Li Guangxing. The 3 of them would go together. Wuk's cultivation is too low, and he is in seclusion to break through the heavenly wheel. He will not go with you, Sword Sovereign Severing Love said. Let's go to the Supreme Tower. As Li Guangxing's voice faded, he and Qin Hao turned into sword light and left the Su Sword Peak. After arriving at the Supreme Tower, Divine Master Wu Jian was waiting for them. Tianyang Qinshin was also there. Senior Divine Master, Senior Tianyang, a few of them said. Tianyang's seniority was low. Although he was an elder and took care of the Academy's affairs, he was also a disciple and cultivated under Wu Jian. Yes, Sword God Wu Jian nodded. He felt the space divine while overflowing from Qin Hao. His eyes were filled with admiration. He said to Tianyang, "Tell them, is it a big deal?" Li Guangxing felt that something was not right. After all, the Academy had asked the 3 of them to join forces. Moreover, their strength was already in the upper echelon among the disciples. Unless they used their cultivation to suppress them, ordinary disciples would not be a match for them. It's not a big deal, but it's not small either. Tianyang pointed his finger in front of them. A huge starry sky map appeared in front of them. Chapter 2078. Floating Glass was located at the intersection of the 3 great sword realms. It was a plane at the very edge and was not under the jurisdiction of the 3 realms, but there were traces of the 3 realms everywhere. The Floating Glass continent's location was rather special. As the primordial chaos surged towards the great Tao sword realm, it bore the brunt of the terrifying power that twisted the stars and was in an extremely precarious situation. At this moment, the ruler of the Floating Glass Palace, Divine Lord Floating Glass, stood in front of the palace and looked at the sky. At the end of the boundless void, a gray ball of qi could be vaguely seen in the depths of the clouds. It was like a huge millstone that contained extremely violent power. It could smash down at any time and destroy the entire Floating Glass realm. Divine Lord, what is that? A young girl standing behind Divine Lord Floating Glass stared with a shocked expression. A plane fragment. Divine Lord Floating Glass said. A plane fragment? The young girl's heart trembled violently as she muttered to herself. Yes. Divine Lord Floating Glass nodded with his hands behind his back. Because the power controlled by the Divine Tao was too strong, A battle between the divine Tao had broken the heavenly Tao and destroyed all life in a world. There were countless remains of continents in the primordial chaos. Some of the remains were very weak, like floating glass, but there were some planes that were destroyed, but the remnant power of the heavenly Tao's collapse was still very strong, such as a master realm. From the looks of it, the gray ball of chi that had entered the sword realm was most likely a fragment of a master realm. It contained the Tao of a fallen divine lord. With divine lord floating glass's strength, he could not shake it at all. Then what should we do? The young girl's face was filled with worry. I have already reported this matter to the 3 divine lords. I believe they will send experts over soon. The only thing divine lord floating glass could do was to guard. The 3 divine lords had used floating glass to demarcate the boundary, showing that they did not belong to any sword realm. However, if something really happened here, none of them would stand by and do nothing. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 3 streams of dazzling sword flows pierced through the void from different locations, heading straight for the floating glass divine palace at an extremely fast speed. They are here, divine lord floating glass thought to himself as he walked down the stone steps and prepared to welcome them. Very quickly, the 3 streams of swords in the sky descended on the training ground. As if they had agreed beforehand, they descended at the same time and turned into 3 groups with extraordinary auras. The young girl looked over in a daze. The 3 groups were all suffused with a strong divine light. If we forcefully twist and destroy it, besides senior severing love, none of us will be able to leave here alive. Qinhao spat out a serious warning. He used the power of the original realm to infiltrate and could vaguely estimate the strength of the master of this divine world from the remnant will of the ruins. It was probably not inferior to Sword God of Ichi. In the face of such a terrifying power, even if it was just the remnant will and a wisp of weak realm power, it was enough to crush this group of weak disciples into dust. So strong? Loi was shocked. You could try if you don't believe me. Qinhao wasn't joking. Junior sister, don't be rash. Li Guangxing understood Qinhao's temperament. It seems like martial arts are forbidden here. Severing love revealed a pensive expression. Qinhao nodded. It's best not to use too much divine power. If we simply investigate, there shouldn't be any danger. The remnant will in the broken world was very special. Qinhao couldn't sense any specific destructive power, but he felt that it was very dangerous. It should be a very rare divine Tao attribute in the elemental wilderness. All right, then in your opinion, where should we investigate first? Severing Love continued to ask. This made his junior brothers a little confused. Wasn't the leader this time the doyen? Qinhao raised his eyes and looked in the direction that Long Tian had left. If he had to choose before, he would have also chosen that direction. The remnant, wolf surging from that direction, was the strongest. However, since the true dragon tribe had gone, the Seamless Academy couldn't interfere. Let's go there. Qinhao pointed in a direction. If my senses are correct, we should be able to find something special. Chapter 2079. Not a single blade of grass grew on the broken mountains. As the wind blew, sand and dust filled the air. The dried riverbed was filled with piles of white bones. Tens of thousands of skeletons were twisted and deformed. None of them were complete. It was as if they were telling a silent tragedy. Qinhao and the others flew in the air against the violent astral winds. The gravel that had been soaked in blood after the war was abnormally hard. It was especially painful when it blew on their faces. After a period of time, they arrived at a dojo surrounded by bare mountains. Looking at the scale, this is also a powerful orthodoxy. Sword God Severing Love looked at the many collapsed divine halls around the dojo. From the ruins, he could vaguely see how glorious it was in the past. It's here. Qinhao was not interested in the past of the ruins. After he landed, he walked to the center of the rubble and waved his finger. With him as the center, divine light swept past. Everything that came into contact with the broken walls turned into dust. In the end, a faint ball of light flickered and emerged from the dust. "What is this?" Lloyd and the rest were curious. They all went forward. Chin Hao stretched out his hand and bent down to pick up the item. Looking at the item in his hand, he could not help but frown. A teapot. The teapot was already damaged. The spout was broken. The ceramic body was covered with deep scratches. The patterns drawn on it had all disappeared. However, it was not completely broken. There was still a shocking divine well flowing inside. "This is the special item that junior brother mentioned?" Danxing and the rest were speechless. They thought they would find a divine treasure, but it was a useless teapot. Chin Hao's face was slightly embarrassed. He did feel a strong divine well flowing here, but he did not expect to find a teapot used for tea. No matter what, it is an extraordinary item. Sword God, severing love, took the teapot from Chin Hao's hand and examined it. He found that the divine well contained in this item was extremely vigorous. Its owner's cultivation was not below his. No matter how ordinary a daily item used by a strong warrior of the divine path was, it would be a supreme treasure in the mortal world. Countless people died because of greed. After that, he returned the teapot to Chin Hao. Since it was found by Chin Hao, it naturally belonged to him. Sword Elder is right, but it is useless in our hands. Danxing looked at the teapot in Chin Hao's hand and let out a strange laugh. Using a teapot as a divine soldier? What a joke. They were sword cultivators. Were they supposed to throw teapots at others when they fought? At least I've gotten something. At least I'll have something to report when I get back. Li Guangxing said. The owner of the teapot was also a weirdo. Of all things to nurture, he used divine power to nurture a teapot. There were all kinds of deities in the great desolate world. Senior brother Guangsheng's insight is especially unique. If the owner of the teapot was still here, you two would definitely become close friends with similar interests. This item is for you. Chin Hao laughed heartily and threw the teapot to him. This? Li Guangxing was speechless. Why did she give him this broken teapot? Congratulations, senior brother Guangsheng. You have obtained a broken divine pot. Loi said. With this item in hand, Li Guangxing could return to the academy to practice the way of tea. Perhaps it wouldn't take long for him to become the god of tea. Ha! Danxing and the others laughed so hard that they couldn't close their mouths. It's the third day of the Lunar New Year. The origin of this fragment of a main realm shouldn't be simple. It will probably take some effort to find the source of power that pushed it. As one of the 6 founding elders of the Academy, Severing Love had been to countless realms in his early years. He was also very knowledgeable. According to the shattered mountains and rivers beneath his feet, as well as the analysis of the various magnificent dojos, the strength of this main realm was not inferior to that of the infinite divine realm. It might even be superior. There were still remnants of the divine master's will, and the realm power hadn't completely dissipated. This proved that it hadn't been destroyed for long. What kind of power had destroyed this main realm? What was its purpose? It was worth pondering deeply behind this. Senior, what are you trying to say? Chin Hao asked. Perhaps we should retreat. Let Infinite, God Lu, and Dragon Master personally force the broken world out and make it stay away from the great Dao Sword Realm. Sword Elder, Severing Love, said solemnly. Senior, are you worried about attracting disaster? Chin Hao had also thought of this. From the looks of it, the person who had destroyed a master realm to such an extent was extremely terrifying. Sword Elder, you are making a mountain out of a molehill. Loi didn't think so. There was no need to trouble her father. Since the powerhouse who destroyed the main realm allowed the fragments of the broken world to drift everywhere, it proved that the other party didn't care. Perhaps I'm thinking too much, Severing Love said. Under the peaceful surface of the Sword Realm, there were hidden dangers in itself. He didn't want to get involved in other matters. Let's search first. If we can't find the source, we will let the Divine Master make the decision himself. Chin Hao was sure that the broken world contained some kind of enormous power. It might be an extremely powerful divine object. It would be a pity to just give it up. All right, Severing Love was thinking for the younger generation. If they found some useful treasures, it would be a good thing. After leaving the ruins of the dojo, the academy team continued to move forward. In front of them, broken mountains rose up and were shattered by the wind that swept through the space. In the sky full of dust, strange shadows howled and shuttled back and forth. They were densely packed, as if an army had drowned the road ahead. Among the countless remnant souls, Severing Love suddenly found a majestic figure in broken armor. He was like a divine general who commanded the army. Where the spear pointed, a terrifying divine light pierced through heaven and earth and blasted toward the academy team. Yes, senior brothers, you should put more effort into improving your divine power of sword principle. The divine method that I practice may not be suitable for you. As Qin Hao was joking around, the surroundings were deathly silent. Shockingly, the sword elder and his fellow disciples were nowhere to be seen in the dust. Qin Hao suddenly woke up and felt that something was wrong. The white particles on his body rolled and merged into the space. He wiped his fingers in front of his eyes, and immediately flaming patterns appeared on his eyes. His pupils emitted a deep fire. Where is this? Qin Hao could vaguely see an area of 100 miles. However, under the divine will of space, he could not see Severing Love and the others within a radius of a few hundred miles. The environment was completely different from the place just now. He had been separated from the academy team. What happened just now? Thinking carefully, every detail appeared in his mind. He remembered that Danxing asked him about the uniqueness of his divine will. Then, it seemed that Li Guangxing suddenly released his sword will. After that, he could not remember anything. It's definitely not amnesia. Qin Hao looked down at his clothes. There was a faint aura of will of Wei left on it. Was the space forcibly distorted by someone to deliberately separate him from the academy team? In this broken world, other than the academy, there is only Rikujinji, Jianshun, and Long Tian from the Dragon Clan. Could be done by Divine General Chun and Long Tian. Jianshun and Long Tian's cultivation were very high. At present, Qin Hao was far from their level. However, neither Rikujinji nor the Dragon Clan were proficient in spatial will of Tao. Moreover, there was no reason for them to deliberately separate him from the academy team. After all, the other party had the extraordinary strength to directly contend with Severing Love. As for Sword Elder, Severing Love would not harm Qin Hao. Thinking of this, Qin Hao felt a chill in his heart. They were not the only ones in this broken world. Besides Jianxin and Long Tian, there was also Tian Luan, whose realm had been destroyed. Qin Hao remembered very clearly that before they were separated, Li Guangxing had struck out with his sword. Who was he trying to kill? Taking a deep breath, a faint taste of dust appeared in his dry mouth. Qin Hao was also a person who had experienced several great calamities in life and death.